The morning shadow wouldn't sit still. The day began like any other in Solace Springs, pink sun melting over endless sand, cicadas tuning their small desert violins until an aging German shepherd named Shadow refused to greet dawn in his usual steady way. Instead of trotting to Miriam Alvarez for the first pat of the day, he planted himself on the weather-worn porch and stared into the horizon, hackles prickling, a low hum caught in his throat. 45 years of desert sun had taught Miriam that coyotes cry and rattlesnakes rattle, but dogs don't look at empty space unless it isn't empty. She tried a whistle, a soft command. Nothing moved him. When she stepped closer, his tail swept once, not in play, but warning. Old trauma, she thought. The things he'd seen as a K9, the partner he'd lost, the bullet scar pulsing beneath gray fur. Even so, this felt different, fresh as wet paint on the soul. Miriam followed his stare toward town, where the courthouse pillars glinted pale gold. Whatever unsettled him flickered somewhere between memory and present danger, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge, Miriam could feel it too, an unease threading the quiet. Shadow, ever faithful, had spoken the only way he could by refusing to move, and that, she realized, was the moment their whole world shifted. The wind came early that morning, dry and whispering, the kind that carried stories and dust and memory. Out in the far edge of Solace Springs, where trailer roofs shimmered under the desert sun and time stretched between cactus shadows, Miriam stood barefoot in the sand behind her rusted trailer, staring at her aging German shepherd. Shadow wasn't moving. He stood by the edge of the dune, ears stiff, nose tilted toward the horizon, like a soldier waiting for a sound that hadn't yet arrived. Miriam held her breath. She knew that stance. It had once meant there was someone lurking beyond the visible, back when he still wore the black vest with the silver K9 badge stitched over his heart. Back when he worked beside men who no longer walked this earth. Now his muzzle was gray, his gait slower, his eyes clouded but sharp when it counted. For months, he had been quiet, too quiet, as if part of him had been left behind in the places Miriam refused to speak of. But today, something was different. His whole body was tense, as though the wind had whispered something only he could hear. Miriam stepped forward, mug of weak coffee warming her fingers, the ceramic chipped in the corner just like everything else in her life. "You feel it too, don't you?" she murmured, voice gravelly from sleep and silence. Shadow didn't look back. He growled a low, guttural warning that vibrated in his throat but never rose. His eyes didn't blink. Miriam felt her own spine stiffen, the way it used to when she was still working in the field, when she still believed she could save people from each other. That was before the system chewed her up, before she fled, before she found this small corner of nowhere with a name that promised peace, Solace Springs, a name that lied more than most people she'd met. She glanced toward the vast nothingness beyond their patch of scrubland flat desert plains, a two-lane highway empty at this hour, and in the distance, the silhouette of the courthouse dome. Nothing moved, but Shadow's star didn't falter. Miriam followed his gaze. Her heartbeat slowed, then quickened. There were no cars, no birds. Even the cicadas were quiet. The silence was the kind that didn't come naturally. It was the kind that arrived just before something cracked open. She crouched beside Shadow, feeling the ache in her knees, one of 1,000 small betrayals her body had collected over the years. She touched the fur behind his ear, gently, as if trying not to disturb the connection he had with something invisible. "Talk to me," she whispered. "What do you smell?" His ear flicked. A tremor ran down his body, then another low growl. She felt it vibrate against her fingertips. Shadow hadn't growled like that in over a year, not since the night he woke from a nightmare, howling for someone named Cruz. She didn't ask who Cruz was. Some ghost deserved to remain unnamed, but now the past was clawing through the stillness of the desert again. And Shadow, her anchor, her witness, was sounding the alarm in a language she still remembered how to hear. She stood, brushed sand off her jeans, and scanned the perimeter of her lot. Nothing but wind and pale light. But her gut tightened anyway. She had learned to trust that feeling. Shadow finally turned to look at her, and in his cloudy brown eyes, there was something ancient, something familiar, a warning. Miriam's breath caught. "I know," she said softly. "I won't ignore it this time." She went back inside the trailer, Shadow close behind, his nails tapping lightly on the linoleum floor. The trailer smelled of dust, coffee, and old books. On the table lay yesterday's mail, unopened, unpaid bills mostly. and a flyer for a community prayer circle that always seemed to avoid addressing what really haunted this town. She pulled a small box from under the sink. Inside, wrapped in an old shirt, was Shadow's retired K-9 badge. The metal had dulled, but the weight of it still pressed like truth. "You've been quiet too long, boy," she said, pressing it gently to his chest. He nuzzled her hand in return. Outside, the wind kicked harder. Something was coming. She didn't know what yet, but Shadow did, and that was enough. The wind hadn't let up. It had turned sharper, like it had grown teeth overnight. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high enough to bleach the desert floor in white light. Miriam had retreated inside, barefoot, mug in hand, hoping the storm inside Shadow would pass like it sometimes did quietly, with a long nap in the comfort of her scent nearby. But the quiet never came. Instead, she heard it. The pacing. Click, click, pause, click. She looked up from the sink where she was rinsing a chipped bowl. The sound was familiar, too familiar. It was the rhythm Shadow used to walk in when they'd arrive at a crime scene. Back and forth. Measuring danger. Mapping grief. Shadow wasn't in the trailer anymore. Miriam dried her hands and stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the brightness. There he was, his dark shape moving in sharp, tight lines along the back fence where the wire had long rusted into the ground. Dust rose beneath his paws as he paced, then stopped. He turned his head to the right, sniffed the air, turned left, pacing again. And then he started to dig. Not aimlessly, not like a dog chasing gophers. This was different, deliberate, urgent. His paws tore into the sand, muscles flexing like they remembered something his mind couldn't name. He dug until his nails hit something hard. Then he growled. "Shadow!" Miriam's voice cracked the stillness. He didn't stop. She grabbed her boots and jogged across the yard, loose pebbles skittering underfoot. Her heart thudded hard against her ribs, not from exertion, but from the cold certainty that something was unraveling. By the time she reached him, he had exposed an old piece of metal buried shallow beneath the surface. It looked like a license plate bent, sun-warped, the numbers no longer legible. Shadow didn't care. His growl deepened, and then he snapped once at the plate, then backed away as if expecting it to bite back. "Hey, hey!" Miriam knelt beside him, reaching for his collar. "It's nothing, boy. Just junk. It's nothing." But Shadow didn't believe her, and she didn't believe herself. He jerked away from her touch and began pacing again, faster now. Tail low, body crouched, ears pinned. Then came the whining. Not loud. Not for attention. It was that fractured whimper Miriam hadn't heard in over a year, the one he used to make in his sleep, when the dreams pulled him back to places she couldn't follow. His front paws trembled. His shoulders twitched. He looked like a soldier watching a battlefield that had returned without warning. "No," Miriam whispered, rising to her feet. Not again. She had spent months helping him heal. Long nights with her hand resting gently on his back. Long days with training exercises disguised as games. The nightmares had faded. The pacing had stopped. But now it was back, and she didn't know what had triggered it. Miriam reached out slowly, palm up. Shadow didn't snap, but he flinched. "Devin," she said quietly, like testing the name against a wound. His head jerked toward her, eyes wild. "Devin isn't here," she whispered. "It's just me." And he barked once, then lunged toward the back gate, as if someone had just crossed a line she couldn't see. The gate rattled on its hinges. The chain scraped against the post. Shadow didn't bark again. He stood stiff, tail straight out, head lowered in a hunter's stare toward the dust plains beyond the fence. The desert was empty, but he wouldn't move. She stepped behind him, slowly, and laid her hand gently on his shoulder. "Talk to me, boy. What are you seeing?" Shadow didn't blink. His breathing was shallow and fast, the way it got when he was tracking something. Only there was nothing to track. And then he whimpered again, closed his eyes, and dropped to the ground as if something inside him gave out. He curled his body in tight paws over his snout, shaking. Miriam crouched beside him, swallowing hard. Her throat burned, not just from the wind and dust, but from memory. The last time he had collapsed like this was the week she brought him home. His paws had been bloodied from tearing at her doorframe. The night he woke her screaming in his sleep, pressing his body against the trailer walls like he was trying to break free from something invisible. Back then, it had taken hours to calm him down. She had slept on the floor next to him, whispering old stories, letting him know he wasn't alone. And now they were back at the start. Only this time, Miriam didn't think it was a dream. She looked beyond the fence again. Nothing. But Shadow's body was telling her otherwise. The pacing, the digging, the barking at nothing, the way he had growled at that metal scrap like it still held a memory he couldn't shake. It wasn't just trauma. It was instinct, and she'd be a fool to ignore it. The wind shifted again, pulling at her sleeves. "I'm listening," she whispered. "Whatever this is, I'm listening." Behind her, the trailer door banged gently in the wind. The wind had died down, but the silence it left behind felt louder, somehow denser, as if the desert had inhaled and was waiting to exhale something it had been holding in for years. Miriam sat on the back step of the trailer, one hand resting on Shadow's ribcage as it slowly rose and fell beneath her touch. His tremors had subsided into exhaustion. Whatever storm had risen inside him had burned through. For now, the old dog lay curled in the patch of dirt he'd torn up earlier, his head turned toward the horizon like he was still keeping watch, even in rest. Miriam tried to relax her own breathing, but the weight in her chest stayed. She told herself it was just a bad morning, just a memory, rising from some cracked place in Shadow's brain. But in her bones, something whispered otherwise. She stood slowly, legs stiff, and went inside. The screen door creaked on its hinges like always, its sound a kind of comfort, familiar, if nothing else. The inside of the trailer was dim. She reached for the kettle, planning to make another cup of that bitter coffee she never sweetened anymore. She'd just poured the water when the phone rang. The sound stopped her. No one called. She stared at the old landline mounted on the kitchen wall, its cord coiled like a snake that hadn't moved in weeks. Her cell sat silent and mostly forgotten in a drawer. Everyone who knew her, what few were left, had given up calling long ago. But the landline kept ringing, steady, unhurried. Miriam walked toward it slowly, eyes never leaving the receiver, as if expecting it to vanish before she reached it. She picked it up on the fifth ring. "This is Miriam," she said, voice even. Static crackled at first, soft and scratchy, like someone breathing too close to the line. Then a voice, shaky, but familiar. "Miriam, it's Alice." Her stomach tightened. The name landed in her like a forgotten bruise. Alice Hammond. A case from 7 years ago. A mother with 2 kids and a restraining order. Miriam had helped her disappear after her ex burned down their garage. They hadn't spoken since. "Alice?" Miriam said, the name tasting like ash. "Is everything?" "You need to listen," the woman interrupted, her voice low and rushed. I shouldn't be calling, I know that. But something's happening. Have you heard what's going on at the courthouse?" Miriam blinked. "The courthouse?" "In Solace Springs." The town center was barely 2 miles away, a place she hadn't stepped foot in for months. It might as well have been another country. "No," Miriam said slowly. "Why? What's going on?" Silence. "Alice?" A sharp intake of breath on the other end. Then, "Something's wrong. It's like the air's turned. And the kids' people are getting sick. They say it's just the heat, but I know better. The mayor's involved. I saw him." Her voice cracked. "Alice?" Miriam said gently, trying to ground her. "What did you see?" But the line went dead. No click. No goodbye. Just the silence again. Miriam stared at the receiver for a long beat before setting it back on the hook. She turned slowly. Her eyes settled on the half-drunk cup of coffee on the table, still steaming faintly in the still air. Nothing about the morning felt normal anymore. Shadow stirred behind her. His ears twitched. His eyes opened foggy, but alert. He was watching her again, like he already knew what she had to do. Miriam exhaled and sat down, her hands absently smoothing over the worn legs of her jeans. The last time she'd gotten involved, truly involved, 4 children had died. The system had buried the truth. She'd buried herself. But some ghosts don't stay buried. Some come back in the form of phone calls and whispering winds and old dogs with instincts sharper than memory. She looked toward the door. The thought of going into town made her skin crawl. And yet, she stood, grabbed her keys from the nail on the wall, and pulled her coat from the hook. It still smelled like cedarwood and cold nights. Shadow was on his feet before she even turned around. "You're sure about this?" she asked him. He didn't wag his tail, didn't bark, just stared. Miriam nodded once. "All right," she murmured. "Let's go see what the desert's been hiding." As she stepped out into the light, Shadow followed close behind, his body moving stiff but steady like something old that still remembered how to fight. The sun was high now, casting long shadows behind the trailer. Dust spun lazily in the air like it always had, but Miriam could feel it. Change. And whatever was waiting at that courthouse, it wasn't finished yet. The courthouse in Solace Springs wasn't much to look at, just a squat, sun-bleached building with sandstone columns that had long since faded to the color of dried bones. The flag above it flapped limply in the breeze, as if even it had given up trying to stand tall in this heat. Miriam parked her old truck across the street, engine ticking in protest as she stepped out. The sun hit her face like a slap, and she squinted behind her glasses, pulling her jacket tight even though the air was already climbing past 90. Shadow climbed down slowly from the passenger seat. His joints moved stiffly, but his posture stayed alert. He didn't wander. He stood by her side, eyes scanning. They hadn't walked this far into town in months. Across the street, the courthouse steps sat in a shadow that offered little relief. But there, hunched like someone trying to hold the sky on her shoulders, was a woman. Miriam saw her before she saw anyone else. Saw her not as a stranger, but as a pattern her soul still recognized. That shaped the curled spine, the shoulders trembling, the fists clutching some worn thing to the chest. Grief had a posture, and Miriam had learned how to read it. The woman looked to be in her 70s, but it was hard to tell. Her gray hair was pulled back with a rubber band, and the dress she wore clung to her like it had stopped fitting months ago. Her hands gripped a photograph so tightly, the edges had begun to curl under the pressure. People passed her like wind around a stone. One man in a suit paused briefly, then kept walking. A younger woman, earbuds in, stepped wide as if grief might be contagious. No one stopped. No one looked twice. But Miriam crossed the street. She moved slowly, not because of caution, but because of reverence, the way one approaches a grave they didn't expect to find still open. Shadow followed, matching her pace. As they reached the bottom of the steps, the woman's voice broke the air. Thin, cracked, not quite pleading, but too raw to ignore. "Please, I don't know what else to do." Her words weren't directed at anyone in particular. They floated like prayers, unanswered. Miriam stepped closer. "Ma'am?" she said gently. The woman looked up. Her eyes were rimmed red and swollen, but still sharp, still fighting. I'm sorry," she stammered, trying to pull herself together. "I didn't mean to cause a scene." "You're not causing a scene," Miriam replied. "You're asking for help. There's nothing wrong with that." The woman blinked, surprised. "Everyone else just walks around me, like I'm not even here." "You're here," Miriam said. "And I'm listening." Ugh. Shadow sat quietly beside her, his eyes trained on the people entering the building, but his ear tilted back toward them. The woman took a breath that seemed to rattle her whole frame. "My name's Estella," she said. "Estella Garza. I've got 4 grandbabies. They're all sick. Started as a cough a couple weeks back. And now they can't keep food down. One of them started shaking at night. Their skin's hot to the touch, like fire. I think it's something worse than the flu." "Have they seen a doctor?" "I've taken them to the clinic. Twice. But they say it's heat exhaustion. Say I just need to keep them inside, give them Pedialyte. But I know my babies. I raised 6 kids in this desert. This ain't normal." Miriam nodded slowly. Estella looked down at the photograph in her hands. It was a candid snapshot, faded and worn, of 4 children sitting on the floor of what looked like a church basement, drawing on paper plates with crayons. They couldn't have been more than 10. The youngest, maybe 4. Each of them was smiling. That innocent kind of smile that only happens when they still believe the world will protect them. "I came here to ask for emergency assistance," Estella said, voice shaking now. "Some kind of medical grant? A referral? Anything. But they won't even file the paperwork." "Said I need a legal guardian certificate. Said the father has to sign consent. The father..." She paused, her jaw tightening. "The father passed last winter. Pneumonia. Left us with nothing." "I'm sorry." Estella shook her head. "They said sorry, too. Right before they told me there was nothing they could do." The courthouse door opened and slammed behind them. More people walked past. No one looked their way. "They're running out of time," Estella whispered almost to herself now. "And I don't know how to make the world care fast enough." Miriam sat down on the step beside her. Shadow scooted in closer, resting his head on Estella's knee. She startled slightly, then let out a soft breath and began stroking his ears. "He yours?" she asked. "Not exactly. He found me when I needed someone most. Guess we've been saving each other ever since." Estella gave a quiet laugh, just a puff of air, but real. "He's got good eyes," she said. "He does. He sees things." Emson, they sat like that for a few long moments. The sounds of the town dull around them, just two women and a dog in the heat, clinging to the frayed edge of what hope still remained. Miriam didn't speak. Not yet. Because sometimes what people need isn't a solution. It's a witness. And Estella had been invisible long enough. The wind had settled into a hush again, as if holding its breath. Miriam sat beside Estella on the courthouse steps, the air between them thick with unspoken questions. Shadow still rested his head on Estella's knee, unmoving, but his ears had lifted. He was listening no longer to comfort, but to something approaching. A low hum came from the street, growing louder, the sound of tires crunching sun-baked gravel. Estella looked up. A sleek, silver SUV pulled into the circular drop-off zone at the foot of the courthouse steps. The vehicle practically shimmered in the sun, freshly washed, tinted windows, chrome accents catching the light like a mirror aimed at heaven. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out with the kind of presence that made people pause. Tall, fit, maybe late 50s, clean-shaven, with thick, silver-streaked hair combed back and sunglasses perched high on his nose. His clothes were casual but expensive. A crisp button-down tucked into tailored slacks, boots too polished for real ranch work. Everything about him said confidence, measured, curated, deeply rehearsed. Estella inhaled sharply. "Oh, that's him." "Him who?" Miriam asked. "The mayor," Estella whispered. "Landon Hayes." Miriam had seen his face before on flyers, television ads during town meetings, even smiling beside ribbon cuttings in the local paper she used to read, when she still cared about what went on outside her gate. "Community first," the slogan read. "Built on heritage, driven by heart." He walked toward them with practiced ease, taking off his sunglasses as he climbed the steps. The smile on his face wasn't wide enough to be suspicious, but just warm enough to seem genuine. "Mrs. Garza," he said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. "It's been a long time." Estella blinked, startled. You remember me?" "I never forget a neighbor," he said gently, crouching beside her like a man accustomed to being adored for humility. Shadow's head lifted. A subtle growl rose in his throat. It was low at first, just a hum beneath the surface, but Miriam felt it immediately, like an invisible tripwire tightening in the sand. The mayor smiled, still composed. "And who's this handsome boy?" Shadow stood. The growl deepened. His fur began to lift in a slow wave along his back. His eyes, usually soft with age, had sharpened to a point. "Shadow," Miriam said under her breath. "Easy, boy." But he didn't listen. His body moved slightly in front of Estella. His stance had shifted, no longer relaxed, but squared like a soldier reclaiming his post. The mayor didn't flinch. He looked down at the dog, then up at Miriam. "He's protective," Hayes said mildly, standing to full height. "Must have a good nose." "He does," Miriam said carefully, rising beside him. "He's retired law enforcement. Used to work K-9 narcotics out of Cochise County." "Ah," the mayor nodded, adjusting his sleeves. "That explains the sense of duty." But Shadow hadn't stopped growling. Estella, caught between embarrassment and gratitude, tried to soothe him, her hand hovering near his head. Now, sweetheart," she murmured. "He's trying to help." But Shadow's growl only intensified. The sound wasn't feral. It wasn't wild. It was precise, targeted. Miriam reached for his collar, fingers pressing just below the brass nameplate. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "He doesn't usually act this way." "No need to apologize," Hayes replied, his tone magnanimous. "Dogs know things we don't. Sometimes I think they see straight through us." Miriam studied his face, then the perfect calm, the unbothered grin, the practiced hand resting casually on his hip. Something about it felt too easy, too smooth. Estella was trying to stand. Hayes reached out to steady her. "Please don't trouble yourself. I heard you were here and came as soon as I could." You did? Estella asked, her voice trembling. But how? I've got friends inside, he said with a chuckle. They told me you'd come looking for help. Told me no one could seem to do anything. And that didn't sit right with me. He crouched again, now at eye level with her. So here I am, he said. And I want to help. And if Shadow's growl had become a steady rumble like thunder that refused to fade. Miriam tightened her grip on the collar. Shadow, she warned again, voice low. Stop. Still. He didn't. Estella looked overwhelmed. I didn't know who else to turn to. They said the paperwork, guardianship, signatures. I didn't know. You don't need to, Hayes said, his voice dipped in warmth. Let me handle all of it. The children need medical attention. That's the only thing that matters. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card, gold lettering on ivory stock. This is my assistant's number. I'll have her arrange everything. Doctors, travel, prescriptions. Don't worry about money. I've got discretionary funds for this exact reason. Miriam watched his face. Not a single muscle twitched. Not a single crack in his veneer. It was flawless. Rehearsed. Benevolent. But Shadow was still growling. The mayor's eyes flicked to the dog. Then back to Miriam. I seem to have made a poor first impression. Miriam forced a smile. He's old, and he doesn't forget. Hayes nodded. Neither do I. Then to Estella. I'll be in touch this afternoon. Get the kids ready. He stood, turned, and descended the steps with the same confident stride. As he reached the SUV, he paused and looked back. Nice meeting you both, he called to Miriam. Shadow's growls ceased the moment the car doors slammed shut. They watched him drive away in silence. Only after the silver vehicle disappeared down Main Street did Shadow finally sit, body coiled like a question unanswered. Miriam placed her hand gently on his head. I know, she whispered, because whatever had just happened, it wasn't kindness. It was choreography, and Shadow had seen the steps before. The courthouse doors closed behind Mayor Hayes with a heavy thud, like the last note of a song meant to linger. Miriam stood still on the warm stone steps. Shadow pressed tight against her side. His body had stopped growling, but not calming. His ears remained pinned. His tail didn't twitch. He was no longer in defense mode. He was in wait. Estella clutched the business card in both hands like it might vanish if she blinked. Her fingers trembled, creasing the fine cardstock, smudging the mayor's clean lettering with sweat and disbelief. Did you see that? Estella breathed. He's going to help. I didn't think anyone would. Miriam said nothing. Shadow shifted slightly, eyes still watching the empty street where Hayes's SUV had disappeared. Estella wiped at her face with a handkerchief that had been folded and unfolded too many times to count. Her voice shook with something like cautious relief. I mean, he just showed up. Like God sent him. Maybe, Miriam said softly. Estella turned to her, eyes watery but wide. Do you know what this means? My babies, they might actually get real treatment. Not just packets of electrolyte powder and wait-your-turn smiles. Real doctors, specialists, and not in some backroom clinic with broken AC. Her face, for just a moment, looked 10 years younger. Miriam looked at the card again. Hayes and Associates, Community Development Office, Solace Springs. It was clean, polished, smelled faintly of expensive ink, and the kind of cologne that never came off a rack. He said he's already spoken to someone, Estella said. He used the word immediate, and Lord knows I've never heard that word from anyone in an office. Did he say what kind of treatment? Estella blinked. No, but he said everything would be taken care of. Doctors, transport, medication. All I have to do is be ready. Miriam's eyes narrowed. Today? In a few hours, he said. That's fast. I know. It feels like a miracle. But miracles didn't come with polished boots and memorized lines. Shadow stepped forward again, standing near Estella, but angled toward the street. His body was braced, not tense, but ready. The kind of stance he'd taken at crime scenes when something didn't add up. Not fear, not aggression. Caution. Estella looked down at him, rubbing his head again. Your dog. He still doesn't trust him, does he? No, Miriam said. And he's usually right. Estella tried to laugh. but it was the kind of sound that didn't know whether to rise or break. Well, I guess we'll find out soon enough. Miriam crouched beside Shadow, resting her hand on his back. She could feel the twitch in his shoulder blades, the readiness to act, to move, to protect. "I need you to be sure about this," she said to Estella. "Because once you step into someone else's van with your grandkids, you don't get a second chance if you were wrong." Instinct. "I'm not sure about anything anymore," Estella whispered. "But what choice do I have?" Miriam stared at her for a long moment. Then she stood and walked a few paces away, lifting her phone from her pocket. No new calls, no updates. Her thumb hovered over a name in her contacts she hadn't tapped in nearly 2 years. Janet Rodriguez. She didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, she turned back to Estella, who was now folding the card into her purse like a document of salvation. The kind of object that gave you permission to hope again. "Do you have anyone you trust who can come with you?" Miriam asked. "Anyone who could ride along?" Estella shook her head. "No one left." "Then don't go alone." "I don't have much choice." Shadow moved again, positioning himself squarely between the two women. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't nothing. Miriam felt that old twinge in her chest, the same one she used to get when a child gave the wrong answer to a simple question, when an adult smiled too easily, when a court-appointed guardian said all the right things with dead eyes. She looked at Estella's face, the hope there, the fragile thread it hung from. "You're a good woman," Miriam said quietly. "I know that. And I know you love those kids more than anything. I'd give anything for them." "That's what worries me," Estella frowned. "Why?" "Because men like Hayes, they know that. They count on it." Estella looked away. Miriam didn't push. She just let the silence settle between them again, letting it wrap around the moment, like dust over bones, familiar, heavy. Finally, Estella stood, brushing off her skirt. "I'm going to get them ready. If he's telling the truth, I can't afford to waste it." "I understand," Miriam said, though part of her didn't. Shadow sat down beside her, eyes never leaving the path Hayes had taken. As Estella turned to leave, she paused. "You really think your dog knows something?" "I think he remembers better than people do." Estella offered a sad smile. "Then I hope for all our sakes he's wrong." She walked away, each step lighter than the one before. Miriam watched her go, then looked down at Shadow. He was still staring, still waiting, still certain. She swallowed hard, fingers tightening around her phone. Because Shadow's unease wasn't trauma, it was memory. And memory, for beings like him, was never abstract. It was scent, sound, blood. It was truth unfiltered, unpolished. And something in that offer had set off the part of him that never lied. The desert slept cold. Out beyond the dim porch light of Miriam's trailer, the sand shifted with the wind like a breathing thing, brushing against tumbleweeds and discarded fence wire, whispering over silence. Inside, the air was still. The clock ticked softly above the sink. A cup of chamomile cooled untouched beside Miriam's elbow. She sat curled on the couch, reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing a word. Shadow was on the floor beside her, his body curled in tight, his breathing deep but uneven. It started with a twitch, a small jolt in his hind leg, like a muscle pulling itself into memory. Then came the low whimper, barely audible. Miriam glanced down, setting her book aside. "Hey," she whispered. Shadow didn't respond. His breathing hitched. His ear flicked. Another jolt, stronger this time, ran down his spine. Then suddenly he yelped. It was sharp, guttural. A cry pulled straight from the center of something raw. Miriam dropped to her knees. "Shadow, Shadow. No, it's okay. You're safe. You're safe," she said, voice low and steady, but her hands trembled as they reached him. He flailed once, just once, as if fighting something in the dark. Then he whimpered again, this time like a plea. His paws moved against the floor, running towards something, or away. His eyes stayed shut, but beneath the lids they twitched wildly. "Shadow." She moved closer, kneeling beside him. Hey boy, come back, I'm here." She reached out, not touching him yet, she knew better. Not until she was sure he wouldn't startle and snap. His body convulsed again, and he gave a broken, strangled bark that sounded nothing like the proud canine he once was. Miriam couldn't bear it. She moved closer, placed her hand gently on his flank, and felt the scar there pulsing. The old wound, hidden beneath coarse fur, was hot. The skin around it tensed as though memory were trying to claw its way back through flesh. "No, no," she whispered, brushing his ear, his muzzle. "Not again. Not tonight." She lowered her head beside his and murmured the only name that ever seemed to reach him in moments like this. "Devon." His ears twitched. She said it again, softer. "Devon's okay. You did everything you could." He knew that. A breath shuddered through Shadow's ribs. "Devon?" she repeated. "You remember his laugh? The way he used to sneak you bacon? Even when he thought I wasn't looking?" Shadow stilled. His breathing slowed, though his paws still trembled against the floor. Miriam cradled his massive head in her lap, stroking the silvered fur along his temple. His eyes fluttered, then opened slightly. And for one long second, he didn't look at her. He looked through her, through the trailer, through the night, into whatever nightmare still echoed behind his stare. "Come back to me," she whispered. His eyes blinked again. Recognition. And then, slowly, he exhaled. The tension bled from his muscles. His tail gave the faintest twitch. His chin settled heavier into her thigh. She didn't move. The desert wind picked up outside, brushing grit against the metal siding like skeletal fingers. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, sharp, singular. Miriam closed her eyes. This wasn't the first time Shadow had fallen into one of these episodes. But tonight felt different, deeper. There'd been a shift earlier that day, something in him that hadn't settled. Even now, lying against her, he wasn't truly relaxed. His paws twitched every few moments. As though sleep was no longer safe territory, she traced the scar again, the one near his flank where the bullet had gone in. Devon had been the one to carry him out of that field. The debrief had been vague, classified even to her just enough truth to appease officials, not enough for healing. Shadow had never returned to active duty after that mission, and Devon hadn't returned at all. "What did you see that day?" she asked softly. "What's still living inside you?" He blinked, slowly, but his gaze softened. His head nudged into her palm like a thank you he didn't have words for. "I wish I could tell them you're still trying," she said. "Still watching, still remembering, even when the rest of us forget." Outside, a freight truck groaned as it passed the distant highway. Shadow let out a deep sigh, as though exhaustion had finally caught up. But Miriam stayed there, holding him long after his eyes drifted closed again. She thought of Estella, of that business card, of how quickly a man like Hayes could appear and offer salvation dressed in kindness. Shadow had sensed something, and now this dream, this scar pulling at him, it wasn't coincidence. It was warning. She brushed his ear once more. "We'll figure it out," she said. "Whatever you're trying to tell me, we'll find it." Shadow didn't stir. But in his stillness, there was something close to trust. The air beneath the trailer was stale with time. Miriam hadn't opened the storage hatch in nearly a year. She had sealed it after the last sandstorm, convinced there was nothing down there worth remembering. But tonight after the dream, after Shadow's trembling body whispered truths no words could carry, she knew it was time to look. The floor creaked as she lifted the hatch by its rusted handle, exposing the narrow wooden ladder that descended into the crawl space. A dry gust of earth rose to meet her, warm and sour like old linen kept too long under weight. She clicked on her flashlight. Its beam cut through the darkness, catching cobwebs, crumbled boxes, and a folding chair with a broken leg. Most of it was junk abandoned files from her days as a social worker, case folders too painful to shred, but she wasn't here for those. She was looking for Shadow's box. It had been years since she last touched it. She didn't even know if she'd kept it whole. Part of her had wanted to burn it once, after Devon's funeral. But she'd held back, like some small voice inside her knew there'd come a day she'd need it again. That day was now. The beam fell across a dented olive-green metal crate, military style, edges worn and latches stiff with corrosion. She dropped to her knees. Shadow hadn't followed her. He lay curled above, near the open hatch, his head resting on the floor, ears occasionally twitching at the sounds below. But he didn't move, as if he knew what she was about to find, and chose to wait instead. Miriam popped the latches open. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed sheet, were remnants of a life Shadow never got to finish. His K9 unit collar, An old patch with Devon's initials sewn in faded thread. A blood-stained bandage, still folded. And at the very bottom, a thick file marked Operation Red Sable. Knoin Unit 47. Handler, Devon Reyes. Partner, Rex. Call sign, Shadow. Her hands trembled. She pulled the file from the box and sat cross-legged on the concrete floor. Dust trailing from the pages like memory shaken loose. The first few sheets were routine. Medical forms, handler assessments, obedience scores, all immaculate. Then came the mission reports, or what was left of them. Most of the pages had blacked out lines, names redacted, locations blurred by stamps that read classified, do not duplicate. But on one page folded slightly, askew, someone had forgotten to redact a section properly, and there it was. Civilian liaison, L. Hayes, kontraktore D. 22,491, Soljan Corp. Miriam stared at the name as if it might vanish under her breath. Landon Hayes. She blinked, once. Then again, the same man who offered help to a sobbing grandmother just yesterday. The same man who smiled gently beneath the town's flag. The same man whose voice made people feel safe. Shadow had growled when he approached. Now she knew why. She flipped the page again. A grainy image was stapled to the final report. 3 men standing near a Humvee, desert at their backs, sun high and sharp. In the center was Devon, smiling that crooked smile she remembered from their rare phone calls. His hand rested proudly on Shadow's neck. And beside them, younger but unmistakable, stood Hayes, clean-shaven, eyes sharp, clipboard in hand. Miriam's breath caught. She looked up toward the hatch, where Shadow waited. He hadn't moved, but his tail thumped once against the floor. Soft. A signal. She turned back to the file. The rest was even murkier. One entry listed, Containment breach at Sector 12B. K-9 engaged unauthorized personnel. Another noted, loss of handler under ambiguous conditions cause under internal review. But it was the last page that froze her blood. It was a memo. From Soljan Incident Review Board. Subject, termination of non-standard witnesses. Effective immediately, any canine second associated with Project Tier 3 engagements must be retired from service and placed under restricted observation if adoption occurs. Psychological anomalies noted in Case Rex, 4-7 Shadow, potential recall if instability increases. They had monitored him. All these years, she thought he'd been forgotten, left to heal, to age in peace. But he had been marked. And now, with Hayes back in the picture, that wound, the one Shadow still carried deep under his fur, was reopening, not just in body, but in purpose. Miriam sat in the silence for a long while. She traced the edge of Devon's photo, fingertips brushing the lines of his uniform. He had died under ambiguous conditions. Shadow had been deemed psychologically unstable, and Landon Hayes had somehow walked away from it all and into office. Her mind turned to Estella, to her grandchildren, to the strange, hollow look in Hayes' eyes when he'd made his generous offer. This wasn't over. Miriam gathered the file, closed the lid of the box, and ascended the ladder. As she emerged into the night air, Shadow lifted his head. Their eyes met. She didn't need to say anything. He already knew. She set the folder down on the table, turned on the porch light, and sat beside him in the darkness. Her hand found his fur, steady and slow. "Tomorrow," she said, almost a whisper. "We ask the questions no one wants answered." Shadow didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to. The wind had died by the time Miriam stepped back inside. But the stillness carried its own weight, like the desert was holding its breath, listening. She placed the folder on her kitchen table. It sat there under the yellow glow of the single overhead bulb, its edges frayed, corners curled like old secrets. Shadow lay nearby on his bed, his chest rising and falling in a slow, watchful rhythm. He hadn't slept since the file was opened. Neither had she. Miriam opened the folder again, slower this time. She turned past the records, past the half-redacted mission logs and clinical assessments, to the page she remembered Devon's photo. Only now, she saw something she hadn't before. Tucked behind the photo, nearly pressed against the back flap of the folder, was a second image, slightly bent. Black and white, but clearer. sharper, like someone had taken care to preserve it. She pulled it free and laid it beside the first. This wasn't just a snapshot of deployment. This was something far more intimate. In the photo, Devon kneeling in the sand, his arm draped over Shadow then younger, his ears still sharp, fur darker. They both looked straight into the camera. There was a joy in Devon's smile that Miriam hadn't remembered until now. It wasn't the formal smile of a soldier. It was the smile of someone who trusted what stood beside him. But it wasn't just them. Standing just a step behind, not quite in the center, but close enough to claim significance, was Landon Hayes. No clipboard, no sunglasses, no signature jacket or mayoral polish. Just a younger man in fatigues, boots caked in dust, mouth set in that same thin line she now saw at town hall meetings. His arms were crossed, not in command, but in distance. And though he was looking at the camera, his body leaned subtly away from the others. A civilian contractor, the report had said. But the photo told a different story. Miriam leaned closer. The badge on Hayes' chest wasn't the standard issue for support personnel. It was marked with a dark emblem, curved wings around a downward-pointed triangle. She didn't recognize it. But something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong out there. She pressed her fingertips to the edge of the image, careful not to smudge it. Her breath trembled just slightly. "You remember this day," she said quietly, not looking at Shadow. "Don't you?" The dog lifted his head. His gaze shifted to the photo, then back to her. And then, slow, deliberate, he pressed his snout forward and nudged the corner of the picture, letting out a breath that almost sounded like a sigh. It wasn't just a memory. It was the day something fractured. She thought of the way Shadow had reacted to Hayes outside the courthouse. Low growl, steady stare, unmoved by pleasantries. She thought of the classified memo that labeled him unstable, dangerous. And now, she was beginning to understand why. It wasn't trauma. It was memory. Living, breathing memory. She glanced again at Devon's face. Gone too soon. And yet, still present. Etched in Shadow's reactions. In the way he stood, guard at the fence. In the restless pacing. The way he tracked Hayes with his eyes like someone who never forgot betrayal. The betrayal didn't come from gunfire. It came from within. Miriam reached for the magnifying glass she kept in the drawer and hovered it over the lower right corner of the photo. A faint serial number. And something else barely visible in the photo's bottom margin. Handwriting. Scrawled in blue ink, faded but still legible. Echo never came back. Watch Hayes. D. Her breath hitched. Echo. She remembered now a story Devon once told her on the phone, back when he still had energy for more than silence. A K-9, just like Shadow, who went missing during a classified containment drill gone wrong. A drill that wasn't supposed to happen. Devon had brushed it off, blaming faulty communication between handlers and contractors. But now, Echo never came back. And Devon had known something. He had written this note, knowing it might be found. Miriam felt her hands tighten around the photo. It wasn't paranoia. It was a warning, a breadcrumb, left in case someone was willing to follow it. And she, of all people, had buried it beneath old trauma, hidden it in a box like it was just another chapter she could choose not to read. She stood. Shadow rose with her. His movements were slower than they used to be. One hind leg trembled faintly when he shifted weight, but his eyes were alert, his ears just slightly forward. Miriam tucked the photo into a fresh folder and labeled it in ink, "Do not forget." Then she walked to the door and opened it. The desert stretched beyond, windless now, but lit in soft gold from the distant porch lights of neighbors who would never guess what lay beneath their soil. She stared out across the dark horizon. "It's not over, is it?" she whispered. Shadow didn't bark. He simply sat beside her, looking the same direction she did, toward the past, toward the courthouse, toward the shape of a lie too large for any one person or dog to carry alone. And somewhere in the breeze, the night gave no answer, just silence, a waiting kind of silence. The trailer park clung to the edge of Solace Springs, like a memory the town didn't want to claim. Mismatched fences leaned into the wind, some made of corrugated steel, others strung together with fraying rope and wire. The dirt road curved between trailers dulled by sun and time, each one bearing a tired silence, Windows shaded not just against heat but the world outside. Miriam drove in slow, her old truck rattling slightly as it rolled past an empty swing set with one chain broken. She glanced at Shadow in the passenger seat. His head was low, eyes fixed ahead, not tense but alert. His tail thumped once when she parked. They stepped out together, the desert wind dragging dry leaves across the gravel. Estella's trailer stood near the back of the park, shaded by a dying mesquite. A child's shoe sat forgotten on the steps. Miriam noticed the sag in the awning, the way duct tape sealed the corners of a cracked window. She knocked gently. Estella opened the door a few inches, eyes tired, mouth trembling slightly when she recognized them. "Miriam," she breathed, hands still on the chain lock. You came." "I said I would." The door unlatched. A wave of stale air drifted out, something faint and sour beneath the scent of fabric softener. Miriam stepped inside. The living room was cramped but clean. Old quilts softened the sofa, and rosaries hung beside faded family photos on the wall. A box fan turned slowly in the corner, stirring more dust than relief. "They're resting," Estella said, voice low. "But they wake up a lot." "Fevers?" She led Miriam down a narrow hall to a bedroom where the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves held their breath. 4 children lay on mismatched beds and blankets, 2 boys, 2 girls. Their skin had a grayish pallor, lips pale and cracked. One of the younger girls whimpered in her sleep, curling tighter into herself. Miriam stepped closer. Their hair was thinning. The eldest boy's fingernails were discolored, a sickly bluish tinge at the base. The room smelled faintly of bleach, like someone had scrubbed hard to erase something that wouldn't leave. Miriam crouched beside one of the girls and gently pressed the back of her hand to her forehead. "Warm. Too warm." "Estella, are they drinking the park's water?" she asked quietly. Estella's shoulders folded in on themselves. Yes, we all do. There's a spigot out back. It's what we've always used. I thought it was safe." Miriam nodded, then stood and walked toward the kitchen. Shadow followed her, his movements deliberate. As they entered the small galley, he paused. His ears flicked once, then again. And then he did something Miriam hadn't seen since his days in the field. He sniffed the corner of the room, then moved to the sink. He nudged the cabinet beneath it with his nose. Once, twice. She opened it. Nothing unusual. A rusted pipe, a bucket catching a slow leak, a bottle of store-brand dish soap half empty. Then Shadow growled. Low, quiet, but not uncertain. Miriam stood up slowly and turned on the tap. The water ran cloudy for a moment before clearing. She filled a glass, lifted it to her nose, and paused. There was something faintly metallic, almost sweet, but wrong. She didn't drink it. She looked at Shadow. He was staring at the water, unmoving. "I don't think it's the flu," she said aloud. Estella had followed her in, wringing the hem of her blouse. "I've taken them to the clinic. They give me Tylenol, hydration packs. One nurse said maybe mold, but I clean every week." "It's not you," Miriam cut in gently. "You're doing everything right." Shadow padded over to Estella and sat, looking up at her with those deep, unreadable eyes. She knelt instinctively and rested her palm on his fur. Her hand trembled. "They're all I have left," she whispered. Miriam reached into her bag and pulled out a small sample container, the kind she used back when she ran community outreach for soil testing. "I'm going to take some water and some soil from the back, if that's okay." Estella nodded. Outside, the sky had shifted into a soft gold, evening beginning to stretch across the desert like a slow hush. Behind the trailer, Miriam knelt and dug her fingers into the dry dirt near the water spigot. The ground was hard, but near the base of the pipe, it was darker, still moist. She scraped some into a second container. Shadow didn't move from her side. As she rose, a bird startled from a low branch and flew off toward the ridge. The wind carried silence behind it. They drove away just after sunset. In the passenger seat, Shadow kept glancing out the window toward the trailer as it shrank in the distance. Miriam's knuckles tightened around the wheel. The children's faces haunted her, those eyes that looked through her as though they'd forgotten what hope even tasted like. She didn't know what the test would find, but something in her bones, something deeper than instinct, told her the earth was remembering, and whatever poisoned that soil had been waiting to be uncovered. The desert was unusually still that morning, like it was listening. Miriam stood in Estella's backyard, boots sinking slightly into the grainy, moisture-darkened soil. The spigot pipe protruded from the wall like a forgotten limb, half covered in dust and rust, and buzzing quietly beneath its silence. The children were inside, still asleep. Shadow stood beside her, nose twitching, tail low but steady. He hadn't barked, not once. But his stare was unrelenting. He moved toward the spigot again. Without a sound, he began to paw at the dirt. Slow, deliberate, not frantic like a dog chasing a scent, but controlled, trained. Miriam crouched beside him. Her fingers brushed over the surface of the earth where Shadow had scratched a thin layer flaked off easily, revealing a darker underlayer that seemed almost slick, damp, even though the sky had been dry for days. She didn't speak, just opened the small glass vial from her kit and let the earth fall in, grain by grain. Her fingers trembled slightly. It was the kind of tremble that comes not from fear, but from recognition, like some ancient instinct inside her knew before her mind could name it. She reached for her phone and took a few pictures. The pipe, the ground, Shadow beside it. He didn't stop watching. Inside the trailer, the children's breathing floated softly through the cracked windows, barely louder than the wind. Estella was still asleep in the chair next to her granddaughter. Miriam moved back through the narrow hall toward the kitchen, where the sample container she'd left the night before still sat on the counter. She turned the faucet again. This time, she filled 2 new vials, one for immediate testing, the other to freeze as backup. She paused just before sealing the cap and leaned down, sniffing the liquid. The same scent, a sweetness that didn't belong, like apples left too long on the branch. She packed the vials carefully into her bag, zipped them tight, then pulled out her phone again and scrolled to a familiar number labeled only Jen, EPA, private. It rang once, then twice. A sleepy voice answered. "This is Jen. It's me, Miriam." A pause followed by the rustling of sheets. "Are you okay? I need a water analysis run. Soil, too. No filters, no rounding. I need the raw data." She heard Jen sit up. "What's going on?" "Kids are sick," Miriam said, voice low. "Trailer park. Outside Solace Springs. Multiple children. Symptoms consistent with environmental exposure. Vomiting. Hair loss. Nail discoloration. No signs of viral origin." "Jesus, there's more." Shadow's reacting. "He hasn't done that since the mission." The line fell silent for a beat. Then, "You have samples?" "2 vials of tap, 1 soil. I'm overnighting them, and I need discretion." "You'll have it. I'll send photos too. You'll see the discoloration near the pipe." You think it's agricultural runoff?" "I think it's deeper," Miriam said. "I think someone knew it was there." Shadow came and rested his head against her leg. It was something he rarely did, lean his weight that way, gentle but deliberate, like grounding her in the moment. Miriam reached down and ran her fingers through the fur at his neck. The skin beneath twitched. A scar still ran along his flank, where a bullet had once burned through muscle and instinct. He had never forgotten where pain came from. Neither had she. "I'm not jumping to conclusions," she continued. "But the mayor's name came up. Landon Hayes. That's a serious claim, Mir." "I'm not making a claim," she said. "I'm asking for truth. Quietly, before the loud part starts." Jen sighed. "Send it. I'll run it myself." "Thank you." She ended the call and stood still for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle around her. The desert outside pulsed with heat already, though it was barely past dawn. The sky was flat, not a cloud to be seen. But Shadow still stared toward the ridgeline behind the park, ears slightly tilted forward like he heard something no one else could. That kind of stillness didn't come from nothing. She drove to the shipping depot just before noon. The package was sealed in a cooled case, samples labeled with date, time, and GPS. She paid for next-day air with confirmation tracking and walked back to the truck without looking back. Inside the cab, Shadow waited. She didn't speak, just started the engine. On the way home, they passed the courthouse. The steps were empty now. No sign of Estella, no sound of weeping, but Miriam slowed anyway, eyes flicking toward the tall pillars, toward the bronze plaque near the door that read, "For justice to rise, the truth must first be known." She wondered if anyone still read that. That night, she sat on the porch with a cup of tea she didn't drink. Her laptop glowed on her lap, but she hadn't typed anything. Shadow lay beside her, nose twitching now and then, as if chasing scents in dreams. She watched the stars crawl into view. In the dark, things had a way of speaking more clearly. And in that silence, Miriam knew. They weren't chasing ghosts anymore. They were waking something up. The desert morning crept in slowly, wrapping Solace Springs in that peculiar stillness that came before something broke. Light poured through the kitchen window of Estella's trailer, hazy and golden, casting long shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. Miriam poured water into a chipped metal bowl for Shadow. It splashed softly, the sound out of place, in the thick quiet of the small kitchen. She set it down near his paws and stepped back, waiting. But Shadow didn't move. He stood a foot away, stiff-legged. His ears flicked once, then twice, and he stared. "Come on," Miriam murmured. "You've barely drunk since yesterday." He shifted his weight, but didn't approach the bowl. Instead, he let out a low, breathy growl. Not aggressive, not fearful, just uneasy. Then turned his head away, almost sharply, like the scent offended him. Estella watched from the doorway, arms crossed tightly over her thin frame. "He's okay?" Miriam nodded, but her eyes stayed on the untouched bowl. "He's okay, just particular." Estella moved closer, her voice low. "I've noticed the other dogs avoid drinking here too, even strays. They sniff it, then walk off." Miriam crouched and picked up the bowl again, held it under her nose. Same faint sweetness. She glanced at the clock on the microwave. Just past 10 a.m., right on cue. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She stepped outside to take it. "Jen?" she answered. A long exhale came through the line. "Yeah, I've got results." Miriam stepped away from the porch, walking toward the trailer park's edge, where the cactus started to take over the fence line. Shadow followed silently, his movements careful, steady. Jen continued. "I ran everything twice, even had Manny check my readings just to be sure. And—" "Miriam," Jen said, voice low and tight. "It's bad. Real bad." The wind stirred faintly across the dry grass. "You've got DMP-42 inch the water." Miriam stopped walking. "Say that again?" "DMP-42, Jen repeated. "It's a synthetic organochlorine compound. Was used in military training fields back in the 90s before it got banned. Causes nerve degradation, immune system collapse, sometimes linked to birth defects. It breaks down slowly, half-life of decades. It's not supposed to be anywhere near a public water source." Miriam felt the breath tighten in her chest. Her voice, when it came, was almost hollow. "How much?" Jen didn't answer right away. Then, "Enough to explain the kid's symptoms. Enough that I wouldn't drink it, not even to rinse my hands." A silence stretched between them, long and brittle. Jen broke it first. "What the hell is happening out there?" Miriam's mind raced. Echo. Devon. The scar on Shadow's side. Mayor Hayes. She swallowed hard. "It's not just coincidence. Someone knew. Someone let it happen. You need to get those kids off that water." "I know. And Miriam," Jen paused. "Don't say anything to the press yet. Not until we get full confirmation. I'll send a full report by tonight. But be careful. DMP-42 wasn't just banned. It was buried. There were entire defense contracts erased after it surfaced." Miriam nodded, even though Jen couldn't see her. "Thank you." She ended the call, slowly lowering the phone into her jacket pocket. Shadow stood near her feet, watching. Not moving, just waiting. She knelt beside him, fingers finding that spot beneath his collar warm, scarred, familiar. His ears tilted as she whispered, "You knew, didn't you?" His eyes met hers. Something quiet passed between them. Then he turned, walking toward the trailer without needing to be told. Inside, Miriam found Estella boiling rice on the stovetop. The children were awake now, curled under blankets on the floor. Their skin looked paler under the light. One of the younger girls, Isabel, coughed softly, a wheezy, shallow sound that made Miriam flinch without meaning to. She crouched beside the couch and looked at the children, each of them small, tired, fragile, like petals in too much wind. She turned to Estella. "Don't let them drink from the tap! Not even to rinse fruit! Don't bathe them in it! Nothing!" Estella's eyes widened. "What is it?" "I'm not sure yet," Miriam said gently, not wanting to burden the woman with terms like neurotoxin or classified agent. "But it's in the water. I'll bring bottled. For now, use canned goods, and if you need anything else, call me day or night." Estella nodded, hands trembling. "Okay, thank you." Miriam stood, her shoulders heavy with the weight of knowing and not yet telling. Before she left, she stepped outside again, Shadow at her side. He paused near the porch, sniffed the breeze, then turned toward the backyard and barked once. A sharp, sudden sound that echoed across the rusted fences. It wasn't an alarm, it was a signal. She followed him around the trailer until he stopped by the same spot near the pipe. The dirt was still disturbed, but now she noticed something new, a faint discoloration on the metal line where it met the ground. Like corrosion but off-color, faintly greenish. Shadow didn't dig this time. He just stood guard. Miriam knelt again, stared at the pipe, at the ground. Then she whispered to herself, voice almost lost to the wind. They didn't even bother to hide it. She stood slowly, eyes scanning the horizon beyond the trailer park toward the ridgeline, toward where the old Solgen field had once stretched across miles of training ground, buried under heat, under time, under silence. Until now, she placed a hand on Shadow's back. "We're not done," she whispered. His tail didn't wag, but he stayed beside her, still, watching, waiting for the next step. The town library stood like a forgotten shrine, a sun-warped relic of better-funded decades, tucked between an abandoned post office and a tax service that hadn't opened in 3 months. Miriam hadn't stepped inside since the funeral of her supervisor 3 winters ago. She wasn't sure what drove her there now. Maybe it was Shadow's unrelenting vigilance. Maybe it was the look on Isabel's face, pale and slow to blink, like something inside her was fading too fast. Dust clung to every windowsill and shelf inside. The air was dry, sharp with the scent of old paper and mildew. A rotary fan turned above her, squeaking on every pass. The reference desk was unmanned, but the records room door was unlocked. It always was. Solace Springs didn't get enough visitors to worry about theft. She pushed it open and stepped inside. Shadow waited near the threshold, watching. The archive smelled of rust and cardboard. Yellowing manila folders lay stacked on steel shelves that reached the ceiling. Most hadn't been touched in years. Some still had tape over the spines. Miriam didn't need a librarian. She knew where to start. She found the filing cabinet marked Public Health and began pulling records, quarterly illness reports, mortality notices, water usage complaints, coroner memos, decades of them. She wasn't looking for a name. She was looking for a shadow in the numbers. An hour passed, then 2. She lost track of time until the grainy hum of fluorescent lighting above her flickered, and Shadow huffed impatiently from the door. That's when she saw it. 1,997. Pediatric respiratory cluster. 3 cases of severe pulmonary edema, ages 2 to 6. No genetic link. All lived near the northern slope of Solgen Field number 3. 1,999. Seizure incident report. 4 cases of adolescent-onset epilepsy. All cases emerged within 6 months. Residences circled within a 2-mile radius of the decommissioned training ground. 2001. Stillbirth spike. Private memo. Privately advised county health to avoid direct attribution to soil contamination pending results from defense contract number 17G. Her fingers tightened on the edge of the folder. She turned another page, then another. Every few years, like clockwork spikes in unexplained illnesses, neurological symptoms, autoimmune collapse, infant complications. All in neighborhoods within walking distance of the old Solgen testing field. And all brushed off, explained away, erased quietly in the next quarter's summary. She leaned back in the metal chair, breath shaky. Shadow stepped beside her now, resting his chin on her knee. "I knew it," she whispered, her voice a scratch in her throat. "They never cleaned it up." She glanced at the page again. There, in the corner of a 2003 report, was a brief mention. Consulting oversight conducted by Hayes. L, subdirector of facility review team. She froze. Hayes wasn't just a name in the photo. He had been there. Not after. Not in hindsight. During. Miriam closed her eyes for a long moment. Her pulse thudded in her ears. She whispered his name aloud, as if the walls might echo it back with something she missed. Landon Hayes. The pieces were fitting, not with a snap, but with an ache. Quiet, grainy, patient. Like dust settling in a room no one visits. She took her phone from her coat and snapped photos of each file. She knew better than to borrow anything from this place. Paper left no trace, but digital footprints, they mattered. Shadow shifted. His ears perked slightly, then swiveled toward the door, a soft sound like leather on tile, or a boot. Miriam tensed. She turned. The hallway outside was empty, but the door to the main lobby was cracked now, and it hadn't been before. She waited. Nothing came. Still, she moved quickly, gathered the files, returned them with a careful hand, and when she stepped outside, sunlight felt sharper on her face like it had teeth. Shadow didn't need a leash. He walked close, like he used to back in the days of patrols and caution tape. As they crossed the empty lot beside the library, Miriam whispered low, "They buried it all, right under our feet." Now, she glanced west, toward the red hills that used to be Solgen's perimeter fence. Now just brittle mesquite and sun-hardened ground. But it's leaking through the cracks now. Shadow gave a low grunt, and she swore it sounded like agreement. Back at the car, she paused before starting the engine. Her fingers hovered over the ignition, thoughts spiraling. If Hayes had overseen the cleanup, if he'd known the toxin hadn't been contained, and now positioned himself as savior to Estella's family, what was the motive? A cover-up? Or something worse? She glanced at Shadow again. He was staring out the window, ears half raised, eyes fixed on the ridgeline. Not afraid, not angry, alert. Miriam gripped the wheel and pulled onto the highway, the tires spitting gravel behind her. She didn't know exactly what she was driving toward yet, but the past wasn't dead in Solace Springs. It was seeping up from under the dust, and she was going to bring it into the light. The municipal building smelled of lemon cleaner and resignation. The floors were too shiny for a town this worn down, and the chairs in the waiting area were all bolted to the wall like they expected someone to run. Miriam stood at the front desk of the clerk's office, her canvas bag hanging from one shoulder, the folded photos from the library still warm in her coat pocket. Behind the plexiglass, the clerk looked up with the same tired disinterest she'd offered 100 residents before Miriam. Her name tag read K-A-Y, all capital letters in a chipped acrylic frame. "Afternoon," Kay said, voice flat as the desert. "I'm looking for records tied to land remediation." Miriam replied calmly. "Specifically, any decommissioned training zones outside Solace Springs. Solgen properties. Anything from 1995 to 2005. The clerk's hand paused mid-reach for a form. She blinked once, twice, then stiffened. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said. "That type of request would need to be filed formally with the county. We don't hold those here." Miriam's lips twitched. Not in a smile, just muscle memory. She reached slowly into her bag, pulled out the printed EPA guidelines on regional hazard disclosures. Actually, under Section 412(b), anything that affected residential health outcomes in this municipality, especially cases involving child illness, should have a record here, even if redacted. Kay didn't take the paper. Her eyes flicked to something over Miriam's shoulder, then back down. Behind her, Shadow let out a single, low growl. Miriam didn't turn yet. Instead, she folded the paper gently and laid it on the counter between them. "I'm not trying to make trouble. I just want to know if anyone ever filed a complaint about Site 3 Amp here, what used to be the Solgen burn field. There are kids getting sick again. You know that, don't you?" The silence was long. Then, from behind the glass, Kay leaned in just a little. Her voice dropped. "You need to be careful with that name." Miriam narrowed her eyes. "Which one?" "Solgen," she whispered. Something beeped softly above. Shadow turned his head, ears twitching. Then he stood. His tail stiffened. A sound barely audible buzzed from the corner of the ceiling. Miriam looked up. A security camera, newer than anything else in the building, whirred quietly as it rotated toward them. just slightly, then stopped. Shadow barked, a deep, explosive bark that cracked the quiet like a slap. Kay jumped. "Control your dog," she hissed. But Miriam was staring at the lens now, how it seemed to twitch again just as she made eye contact. Shadow stepped forward, placing himself between her and the desk. His hackles were up. Kay reached toward her phone. "I'm going to have to call the building manager." "I'm done here," Miriam said, her voice clipped. She turned without another word and walked briskly toward the door, Shadow moving tightly at her side. He didn't bark again, but his posture told her everything she needed to know. Once they were outside, Miriam exhaled hard. The heat wrapped around her shoulders, but her skin felt colder than before. She walked to the truck, opened the door, and let Shadow hop in first. As she slid into the driver's seat, she checked her side mirror. Nothing. But the itch at the back of her neck didn't fade. She sat still for a moment, hands on the wheel, engine off. Shadow let out a breath through his nose, watching the courthouse steps across the square. "They're watching," she said quietly. "Even in the clerk's office. What are they afraid of, boy?" Shadow didn't move, but Miriam could feel the old weight in her chest, the one she used to get just before a court case was sealed too fast, or a parent she couldn't protect stopped returning her calls. The sense that truth wasn't only being hidden, it was being buried. She pulled out of the lot slowly, passing the welcome sign of Solace Springs. Its paint was peeling. One of the light bulbs had long gone out, and yet it still read with cheery insistence, "Solace Springs, where the future feels safe." Miriam muttered under her breath, "Not anymore." She turned back onto the road, heading toward the one person she thought might still speak freely if they hadn't been silenced already. Because whatever Solgen left behind, it was still poisoning more than just the water. It was curdling silence into fear, and Shadow, ever the quiet sentinel, was done watching from the sidelines. It was nearly dusk when Miriam returned to her trailer. The desert wind had kicked up dust across the porch, soft layers collecting like quiet ash. Shadow leapt out of the truck first, landing with a grunt, then stood at the front step still, ears sharp, nostrils testing the air. There was something waiting. Miriam noticed it almost at once. A manila envelope, resting just beneath the doorframe, tucked half under her faded welcome mat. No postage, no return address. She looked around. No tire marks, no footsteps in the dirt. Shadow didn't bark, but he didn't relax either. She picked it up, brushed the grit from its surface, and stepped inside, bolting the door behind her with a soft click. Shadow paced the floor slowly as she sat at the kitchen table, the envelope before her like a sealed wound. There was no name on the front, only the words, printed in blocky black ink. "You were right to ask." Her fingers hesitated, then she peeled it open. Inside, folded neatly, was a single page, a letter on hospital letterhead, smudged slightly from time and age. The name across the top caught her breath, Dr. Eli Banner, former chief of environmental health at Solace Medical. The date, 5 years ago. The letter read like a confession. To whom it may concern, repeated tests of local groundwater drawn from residential Zone C, including the South Trailer Lot and Outer Solace Springs properties, have shown unacceptable levels of organochlorine contaminants, specifically chlordane, long banned in public use. Concentration exceeds EPA limits. The source, in my professional opinion, may be traced to unremediated chemical runoff from the former Solgen training field. Exposure is most dangerous in children and pregnant women. Symptoms may manifest as respiratory failure, neurological degradation, or unexplained immune collapse. I have submitted requests to have this investigated officially, but I have been told the matter is closed. If this reaches you, do not wait. They won't file this. They won't tell them. Dr. Eli Banner. Miriam's hands trembled as she lowered the page. It was unsigned in pen, but there, at the bottom corner, was the faint imprint of a signature once scrawled in blue, barely visible now. She knew that name. Eli had been the only doctor in town who'd fought for the migrant community, who used to give checkups for free, who stayed late after hours in the pediatric wing with flu-ridden kids from the South Quarter. He'd died of a stroke 2 years ago. Sudden, they said. Peaceful. Now, Miriam wasn't so sure. She leaned back in the chair, breath shallow. The wind outside had grown restless, sifting through the edges of the trailer like it, too, was hunting for answers. Shadow sat beside her, looking not at the letter but at her. Like he remembered the name, too. Like it echoed something inside him from the days before desert quiet, before retirement and grief, before everything unspoken took root in scars and silence. Miriam folded the letter back with a care that bordered reverence. She slipped it into a plastic sleeve, placed it in the old manila folder she'd begun building since Estella cried on the courthouse steps. Documents, photos, patterns. Now this. A truth deliberately buried. She turned to Shadow. We were never supposed to see this. He gave a soft huff, eyes narrowing at the window. Outside, a pickup rolled by slow, then faster. Miriam rose, shut the blinds. She made a copy of the letter that night. 3 copies, actually, and hid them in different places. One behind the broken heater. One taped beneath the passenger seat of the truck. One inside a children's book on the shelf, the kind she used to read to kids like Estella's bright covers, meant to calm small minds before the world taught them fear. Before sleep, she lit a candle and sat on the porch. Shadow lay beside her in the dark, breath steady, but his eyes never closed. The wind shifted again, dry and strange. A far-off howl echoed across the flatlands. Maybe a coyote, maybe not. Miriam touched the letter once more before locking it away. She whispered into the dark, "You didn't die for nothing, Dr. Banner." And Shadow's tail thumped softly once against the floor. The municipal building sat like a sun-bleached monument at the heart of Solis Springs. Spanish tile roof, sandstone arches, a flag that hadn't moved in windless days. It looked the same as ever, harmless in its stillness, but Miriam knew better now. Quiet didn't mean innocent. She parked her truck just across the street. Shadow didn't wait for a command. He jumped down before she could open the door, landing with a soft grunt. His steps were slow, deliberate, not stiff with age, but with tension. The walk to the mayor's office was brief, but Miriam felt every second. She had rehearsed what to say. Not accusations, just gratitude. A gesture of community respect. But behind the practiced calm was a tide of things she wasn't ready to name. Rage, fear, memory. Inside, the air was cooler, recycled and dry. The receptionist looked up and gave a tight smile. "Mayor Hayes is between appointments. Do you have—" "He'll want to see me," Miriam said, voice steady. "Tell him it's about the family he helped this week." Shadow stood beside her like a sentry, ears pivoting with each small sound paper shuffling, keys clicking, breath drawn from behind office doors. The receptionist disappeared into the back. Minutes passed. Then the door creaked open. "Miriam," Mayor Hayes said warmly, arms outstretched as though greeting an old friend. "This is a surprise. Come in, please." She stepped inside slowly. Shadow didn't move. "Your dog can wait out." "He stays," Miriam said. "He's not comfortable around strangers anymore." Hayes chuckled, not unkindly. "Well, he's certainly a loyal one." Miriam gave a small nod but didn't smile. "I just came to thank you. For Estella. The kids. I know they don't have much, and what you did meant the world to her." The mayor's brow lifted in modest dismissal. "It was the right thing. Our town's strength comes from people like her. We can't let anyone fall behind." Shadow hadn't sat down. He stood behind Miriam's left leg, gaze pinned not to Hayes' face, but his right hand resting on the desk. Muscles tight, tail low and still. A statue of bone-deep instinct. Hayes shifted under the dog's stare. Miriam glanced down. He gets like this when something reminds him of his service. PTSD, the vet says. Certain smells, certain voices. "I'm sorry to hear that," Hayes said, placing both hands visibly on the table. "He must have seen some things." "He has," she said. "So have I." There was a pause, a slow settling of something unsaid. "I imagine you've had more than your share of loss," Hayes continued, trying to steer the conversation back into shallow water. "Social work it takes a toll. I didn't leave because of burnout," she said softly. "I left because someone I trusted let kids die." Hayes blinked, smile freezing. "That's a heavy thing to carry." She reached into her bag, not the folder, not yet, and pulled out a wrapped loaf of cornbread. Homemade, still warm. "A thank you," she said. "From Estella." He accepted it gently. "That's kind, truly." But Shadow's low growl rose deep. guttural, barely restrained. Hayes froze, eyes darting toward the dog. "Easy," Miriam whispered, resting her hand on Shadow's neck. But he didn't ease. "I don't know what's wrong with him today," she said, though her voice lacked apology. Hayes set the cornbread on his desk and pushed it slightly away. Shadow's eyes didn't leave him. Miriam finally let the silence stretch. Let it breathe the way truth sometimes only can, in stillness. "I read somewhere," she said, tone casual, "that scent memory in dogs never fades. They remember faces, hands, even years later." Hayes tilted his head. "That right? Some handlers say their dogs recognize people from another life. Good ones and bad ones." He laughed lightly, forced. "Well, let's hope I'm in the first category." Miriam didn't answer. Instead, she slowly pulled a business card from her pocket, the one Dr. Banner had written on years ago, faint pencil lines still pressed into the back. She slid it across the desk. "I'll be going now," she said. "Didn't mean to keep you long." "Ems?" Hayes picked it up, confused. "Banner? I haven't heard that name in years." "No reason you should," Miriam replied, voice soft. "But I thought it might jog something." His fingers clenched just slightly, barely, but Shadow reacted. A sharp bark exploded from the dog's chest, making Hayes flinch in his chair. "Get him out of here," he snapped. But Miriam stayed still. Shadow never bites unless he remembers. Hayes stood abruptly. "I don't know what you think you're implying, but I've spent years building this town up. Don't let old ghosts twist your perspective. Old ghosts are still buried in your dirt," she said calmly. And with that, she turned. Shadow followed her out, head held high, eyes never once blinking as he passed the mayor's desk. Behind them, the door shut with a quiet finality. Outside, the heat struck like a wall, but Miriam felt a cold certainty settle in her chest. Shadow trotted beside her, then nudged her hand with his muzzle. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she murmured. He didn't bark. He didn't need to. They both knew. The past wasn't done yet. Miriam hadn't planned to return so soon. But when Hayes called her phone less than an hour after their meeting, his voice smooth as polished stone, asking if they could clear the air, she knew she couldn't ignore it. Not when Shadow had growled like that. She arrived just before sunset. The mayor's office was empty except for him now, blinds drawn to shut out the desert gold that painted the town in half light. There were 2 glasses of water on the table, one untouched, one already sweating. Hayes gestured to the seat across from him. "Thank you for coming back." Miriam sat without speaking. Shadow settled at her feet, body pressed close, his breathing slow but coiled with tension. He didn't close his eyes. "I was thinking about your dog," Hayes said, smiling as if trying to break tension with charm. "And about Devon." Miriam didn't react, but she noticed it. The way Shadow's ears angled ever so slightly forward, alert, listening. "You said his name once, didn't you?" Hayes continued. "Back in the hallway outside the courthouse years ago. You were helping veterans reintegrate. I didn't think you'd remember me from then." Miriam said nothing. Hayes leaned back. "I want to be clear, Miriam. I respected Devon. Everyone did. He gave his life to save his unit. That's the kind of sacrifice that deserves to be remembered for what it was noble. Not," he paused, searching, "not tainted by questions." Still, she said nothing. Hayes reached into a drawer and pulled out a small laminated photo. It was the same image Miriam had found days ago, the one in the field file. 3 shadows standing in sun-bleached dirt. Devon in uniform. Shadow younger, prouder, tail mid-wag. And beside them, a contractor in desert gear, face shaded by a cap. Hayes pointed to himself. "That's me. Before politics. Before Solace Springs." He smiled again, this one slow and reflective. "The mission we were on? Operation Welkin? God, the heat was unreal. We were tasked with escorting biohazard cargo from a decommissioned Solgen testing facility. I was just the logistics guy. Devon was there with Shadow. It was supposed to be a clean retrieval." Shadow shifted. His paw moved forward just slightly, chest rising faster. "But we were ambushed," Hayes said, voice lowering as though trying to add weight. "An IED on the access road. We lost a vehicle. Devon went back. He pulled 2 men out. He was the last one to make it back to the blast zone. Shadow wouldn't leave him." His gaze flicked down toward the dog now, then back to Miriam. "It was heartbreaking. We called in medevac, but it was too late. Devon died shielding another man. He paused again. And Shadow? He wouldn't eat for days. It's like he knew. Like he blamed himself. The silence in the room deepened. Miriam slowly rested her hand on Shadow's neck. It was trembling. Not fear. Not pain. Memory. Hayes tilted his head. I thought maybe hearing it from someone who was there might bring him peace. Miriam finally spoke. Quiet. Level. That's not how the field notes describe it. Hayes blinked. She continued, voice still gentle. They said the convoy was redirected without command clearance, that a non-military contractor gave the order to take the ridge trail. They listed civilian interference as a contributing factor. Hayes didn't speak right away. Miriam watched him carefully. The civilian's name was redacted. Hayes's hand twitched just once. Then he smiled again. Slower now. You know how messy those reports can be. Everyone's covering themselves. Blame goes round in circles. Shadow rose to his feet. The growl returned. Low. Rumbling. Deeper than anything Miriam had heard from him before. Hayes froze. I think he remembers, Miriam whispered, eyes locked on the man across from her. The mayor stood, calmly, deliberately. Let's not mistake trauma for truth, Miriam. Dogs don't hold grudges. People do. He walked toward the window, cracked the blind with 2 fingers. The courthouse bell tower cast a long shadow across the town square. Streetlights hadn't come on yet. There are stories that serve, he said over his shoulder, and stories that tear down. Devon was a hero. That's what this town believes. That's what his family was told. He turned. And if it's about helping those kids, I'll still help. But if it becomes about opening old wounds, stirring ghosts, I suggest you think long and hard about what good that will do. Miriam stood slowly. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She only said, some ghosts don't stay buried, no matter how many lies you pile on top. Then she turned for the door. Shadow followed. At the threshold, she looked back one last time. The sunset caught in the glass behind Hayes. He stood there, calm, composed, and hollow. Outside, the air had cooled. A breeze stirred dust at the edge of the curb. Shadow didn't stop growling until they were 2 blocks away. The wind had stilled. That eerie hush, the kind that settles in desert towns after midnight, where every sound feels sharper and every instinct louder, wrapped around Miriam as she zipped her jacket and stepped outside. Shadow was already waiting, rigid as stone near the back gate, his eyes locked on the horizon. He had been pacing since dusk, something in him restless, almost reverent. He'd scratched the ground once, then looked at her, not with confusion, but certainty. Now he trotted ahead, tail low, nose to the air. Miriam followed him in silence, flashlight in hand, but not yet switched on. The moon was full enough to walk by, and somehow, the quiet seemed to respect them, parting like a curtain as they left her property line and made their way toward the foothills beyond Solace Springs. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Shadow never paused. They crossed old fence lines, barbed wire rusted to dust, metal signs half buried in sand. The air grew colder as they descended slightly into a shallow ravine where brush curled in on itself like dried hands. And then she saw it. A low building, buried behind tumbleweed and chain link, its corrugated roof sagging at the corners like tired shoulders. The sign above the locked doors had faded to nothing, but the symbol stenciled on the metal gate was unmistakable. Solgan Industries. Shadow growled not out of fear, but recognition. He pawed once at the gate, then stepped back, letting her decide. Miriam approached slowly. The lock was old, but had been recently replaced, too shiny. Still, someone had left it lazy. One turn with her pocket wrench, and it clicked open. The door groaned as it swung inward. She stepped inside. The smell hit first, chemical sweetness layered over dust and time. She knew that scent. She had smelled it faintly on Estella's clothes, on the children's breath. Now it was here, thick and unmoving. The warehouse was bigger than she expected. Metal shelves stretched deep into darkness, rows upon rows, like the ribs of a forgotten body. Her flashlight flicked on with a low buzz, its beam cutting through the gloom. Then it caught something. She stopped breathing. Dozens of barrels, gray, with green lids. A stenciled label on the side of each. R-Diox 42B. Restricted use only. Property of Solgen. Date of seal, Feb 2025. Miriam moved closer. Her fingers trembled as she brushed away a layer of dust. Beneath the warning label, there was something hand-scrawled in faded marker. For soil stabilization trials, Phase 3. Location: Solace Springs. Perimeter. She blinked. Phase 3. That meant this wasn't just leftover stock. This was recent. Ongoing. Shadow padded forward and sat beside one of the barrels, ears angled backward, body low. He didn't growl, but his stillness was louder than any warning bark. Miriam snapped a few photos with her phone. She circled the barrels, counting 23 in total. One had a slow leak, its seal broken at the rim. A greenish residue, crusting where metal met air. The floor beneath was stained black. She crouched. The stain bled outward like a wound, and embedded in the center of it was a child's shoe, tiny, faded pink, half buried in dried chemical mud. Her stomach lurched. She stood quickly, hand pressed to her mouth. How long had this warehouse been here? Who had left that shoe? And how many others had come through, like Estella's grandchildren, with no idea what poisoned the water they drank or the ground they played on? She snapped another photo, then another. Behind the barrels, she found a stack of shipping invoices, all addressed to an unregistered storage unit just outside city jurisdiction. The sender? Hayes Development Group. Not Solgan. Hayes. Shadow growled again, and this time, it wasn't low. It was loud. Miriam turned. A flashlight beam had appeared at the far end of the warehouse. Someone else was here. She clicked her own light off and stepped behind the shelves, Shadow close to her leg. The other beam moved slowly, sweeping left to right. No voice called out. No footsteps, just the quiet scrape of metal on metal as the barrels were examined. Miriam held her breath. Shadow didn't bark. He didn't move, but his body tensed, like a bowstring pulled to its limit. Then, just as quickly, the beam turned off. Darkness returned. Silence fell again, but not the same kind. This one hummed with knowing. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. Whoever had come was gone. Finally, she crept back out, flashlight flicking on. The barrels were untouched, but her footprints near the leaking one had been joined by another. Larger. Fresh. Miriam stepped outside and locked the gate behind her. She didn't say anything. Didn't need to. Shadow trotted ahead again. Not toward home, but toward the courthouse. Because it wasn't just about poisoned water now. It was about who signed for it. And why the mayor of a small desert town had been lying since the day Devon died. The sun hadn't yet crested the ridge when Shadow pulled her from sleep. It wasn't barking. It wasn't whining. It was a presence urgent and quiet, the weight of him sitting beside her bed, head bowed low, breath steady but shallow, like something inside him had been stirred and couldn't be ignored. Miriam sat up, bleary-eyed. Shadow? He looked at her once, then turned toward the door. She knew that look. Boots laced, jacket thrown over her shoulders. She followed him out into the sharp morning air. The desert was still holding on to the night's cold, the kind that bit through denim and rattled memory. Above them, the sky was streaked with lavender and rust. Shadow moved fast, faster than usual. His limp, the one from the shrapnel wound, seemed to vanish. Each step was deliberate, focused. They left the trailer behind, winding through dry brush and old riverbeds, past broken fence posts and brittle cactus skeletons. The trail wasn't one she recognized, and yet Shadow never hesitated. 30 minutes passed before they reached it. The old lake bed, once known as Morrow Lake, before drought and time drained it to a cracked bowl of silence. Now, only the wind visited here, and secrets. Shadow descended the slope slowly, sniffing, pausing, then continuing with surgical precision. Miriam hesitated at the rim, eyes scanning the dry basin. The silence here wasn't peaceful, it pressed against the skin. Watching. Shadow stopped near the center of the lake bed. He pawed the dust, then sat beside a shallow depression in the earth, waiting. Miriam approached. The closer she got, the stronger the stench became. Earth, decay, and something faintly metallic. She crouched. There, beneath a scattering of dead leaves and loose dirt, were bones. Small, brittle, animal, not human. She could tell by the curvature of the ribs, the canine still intact. Her breath caught. There wasn't just one set. There were 3, maybe 4, all clustered in a loose ring, like something had died here more than once, and no one had noticed. Then she saw it, nestled between 2 ribs, a collar tag, rusted, but intact. She reached for it, wiping the dirt away with the hem of her sleeve. The letters were almost gone, but not completely. Echo. Her hand trembled. Another K9? She looked at Shadow. He was standing now, stiff and alert, ears turned slightly outward, not toward her but toward something else, a direction, a memory. "What happened here?" she whispered. The wind responded before he did. A sudden gust swept across the lake bed, carrying with it a rattle of leaves and a voice. Not a real one, a remembered one. "We don't bury our mistakes, Hayes. We bury the dogs that knew better." The phrase came unbidden, a line she'd read once, years ago, in a court transcript tied to an old whistleblower case involving Solgen. She hadn't thought about it in years, but now, standing over bones, the meaning settled in. This was no accident. These were not pets. These were working dogs canine, second like Shadow, trained, deployed, discarded. And the name Echo wasn't just a name. It was a program code name buried deep within Shadow's file, mentioned only once in redacted lines. She felt sick. The earth here wasn't just dry. It was silenced. "Why bring me here, boy?" she asked softly. Shadow looked at her, his gaze not desperate, but mournful. She knelt and touched his head. "One of yours." A soft whimper escaped him. Not fear, not pain, recognition, grief. She turned back to the collar and tucked it into her jacket. They stayed there a while, Miriam standing beside the bones, Shadow lying down beside them, his muzzle resting on the dirt. The wind moved again, and this time it carried something else. An emotion. Regret. "Come on," she said finally. "We can't leave them here. Not like this." She returned to the truck for a blanket and a small spade. Over the next 2 hours, she carefully collected the remains, each bone placed with reverence. Shadow watched, unmoving. When it was done, they drove back in silence. Later that night, she would catalog the tag, cross-reference Echo's mention in the military archives, and discover that 5 dogs, experimental canine second, had been deployed under the Echo program. Only one was listed as surviving, Shadow. The others were lost during field trials. And one of the overseeing contractors? Landon Hayes. Miriam sat on the steps of her trailer that evening, the desert turning amber behind her. Shadow lay beside her, his breathing slow, his eyes heavy with something ancient. "You weren't just warning me," she whispered, fingers brushing the tag in her pocket. "You were remembering." The wind shifted again. It carried the kind of silence that held promise, not of peace, but of reckoning. And for the first time since Devon died, Miriam didn't feel alone in the fight. It began with a sound Miriam couldn't place. Not a growl, not a bark. A low, keening whine, thin at first, barely audible over the desert wind, but it grew sharper, more urgent, curling up from deep within Shadow's chest. She turned from the sink, the cup in her hand, trembling slightly at the edge of hearing it. Shadow was by the back door, his tail tucked, ears pinned, eyes wide and glassy, fixed on nothing. He wasn't here. His body was, rigid and still. But his mind? Gone. "Shadow?" she asked softly, kneeling beside him. The dog didn't blink. And then he started to tremble. It was the leash, just a simple length of faded canvas, looped around his collar. She hadn't thought twice about it, just hooked it on before they left the lake bed. But now, it hung taut against his side, swaying slightly like it was alive, like it remembered. And suddenly so did he. A field. Dust choked the air, kicked up from boot heels and helicopter rotors. Somewhere nearby, automatic fire cracked through the silence. Devon's voice, screaming. "Fall back." Echoes down, then barking, panicked, frenzied. Shadow's muscles jerked. His head swung wildly as if he were being pulled, leash yanked forward by invisible hands. He lunged into nothing and crashed against the doorframe. Miriam gasped and caught him before he could fall. "It's okay, boy, it's okay, you're home." But he wasn't Flash. Echo, the other dog, sleek, younger, fast collapsing in mid-run. Her leg twisted under her, blood soaking into sand. She let out a sharp yelp, then silence. Shadow tried to reach her. Devon was behind him, calling his name. "Shadow, come!" But Shadow didn't listen. He turned to Echo, and that was when it happened. Fire. A wall of it rolling across the horizon. From a barrel or a bomb, he didn't know. But it ate everything in its path. Echo disappeared into the smoke, and Shadow remembered the way her eyes looked back at him one last time. That was the moment he screamed. Not barked, screamed. A sound no animal should ever make. Another flash. Devon running toward him, grabbing the leash. "We're not leaving her!" But then, a gunshot. Devon jerked mid-step, knees folding beneath him. His hand never let go of the leash. Shadow was pulled down with him. Everything went silent after that. The leash went slack. Back in the trailer, Shadow's breath was ragged, his chest heaving like he'd run miles. His eyes flicked around seeing ghosts Miriam couldn't. She crouched beside him, her fingers trembling as she removed the leash from his collar. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know." Shadow collapsed to the floor, curling in on himself. His body was still trembling, but the whining had stopped. Miriam stared at the canvas leash in her hands. It was frayed in places, one metal clasp warped, still bearing the military initials that had long faded. K9ECHOUNIT. She remembered now there was one field report that mentioned behavioral triggers associated with the retention of original leashing devices. And she had just pulled him back into the fire. Her throat tightened. She moved slowly to the bookshelf, pulling down the box of mission records again. Her hands sifted through until she found the photo. Devon, Shadow, and beside them barely 20, still in uniform, Landon Hayes. She turned it over. A single line in Devon's handwriting. "We leave no one behind, especially the ones who'd never leave us." She exhaled shakily and went back to Shadow, who now lay curled tightly near the threshold, staring blankly at the wall. Miriam knelt again and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "I know what you saw," she whispered. "You didn't forget. You never did." His ear flicked. "I didn't see it then, but I do now. That field wasn't just a test site. It was a graveyard." Shadow turned his head toward her, his eyes bloodshot but steady now. In them was something deeper than memory, something closer to promise. "Echo," she said aloud. The name tasted like ash. She stood slowly, leash still in hand, and opened a drawer. Inside was a box of matches and a tin can she used for scraps. One by one, she fed the leash into the tin. The fabric curled, blackened. The metal hissed and popped. Shadow watched, without moving. When it was done, she placed the can outside to cool. No more triggers, only truth. That night, when she lay in bed, Shadow climbed up beside her, not something he often did. He rested his head against her chest, his breathing finally quiet. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere beneath it, the name Echo whispered across the desert. Not a memory now, a reckoning. Dawn came quietly to Solace Springs. The kind of light that didn't announce itself, just bled through the seams of the world. No birdsong, just wind brushing past sun-worn trailers and forgotten windows. Miriam sat alone on the front step, the desert stretching quiet before her. A mug of cold coffee in her hand, untouched. Shadow lay at her feet. He wasn't sleeping, he wasn't guarding, he was just there, as if presence itself was all he had left to give. She looked at him, really looked. The gray on his muzzle had spread since spring. The fur around his scar, it twitched sometimes. When he dreamed, like it remembered fire. And that morning, for the first time since he collapsed after the flashback, he met her eyes. She didn't need words. The truth was there, bone deep. He'd never forgotten. Not the mission. Not Devon. Not Echo. Not the moment it all turned to ash. Not the man who walked away. Miriam swallowed hard. She reached down, brushing her fingers over the place where his military tag once rested. "They left you with the memories," she said quietly, voice raw, "and never gave you a way to carry them." Shadow closed his eyes, but his ears twitched. He heard every word. Miriam stared into the wide, cracked silence of the desert, and for the first time, she let herself remember the version of herself before all this. Back when she still believed in the system. Back when she worked late nights filing appeals, speaking up in court, believing truth alone would be enough to change things. But it hadn't been. The system buried what it couldn't handle. Like Echo, like Devon, like Shadow's pain, and hers. She set the mug down beside her, stood slowly, and walked inside. Shadow followed on quiet feet. At the back of the trailer, a box of case files lay sealed beneath a dusty wool blanket. She hadn't opened it in 2 years. Not since her last court loss. She peeled back the tape. Inside were fragments, newspaper clippings, a half-finished affidavit, scribbled notes in Devon's hand, and the photo, the one with Hayes standing just far enough to the side, like a shadow that didn't want to be remembered. Miriam laid the photo flat on the table. This time she didn't look away. Shadow sat beside her, tail curled, breathing steady. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was memory. And it was time. She opened her laptop. The screen blinked to life, pausing on the desktop background. A younger version of her and Devon, standing beside their assigned canine second. Shadow barely recognizable back then, lean and dark, and burning with instinct. Echo was beside him, her eyes clear and wide, not yet dulled by war. Miriam opened a blank document. Title: The Things We Buried in Solace Springs. She didn't start with data. She started with a name. Devon Reyes, K-9 handler, U.S. contractor. Deceased on paper, but never forgotten. Then another. Echo, German Shepherd, K-9 unit. Status: lost in field operation. No retrieval, no record. And then another. Shadow, retired K-9. Survived. She paused, fingers hovering above the keys. Shadow watched. "You were never just a dog," she whispered. Her voice cracked, but she kept typing. She wrote what Devon had told her the night before deployment about Solzhen's cover-ups, about unregulated tests, about barrels marked experimental pesticide being buried near the training fields. She wrote about the field report that never made it into evidence, about Hayes' name on the mission briefing, scrubbed from public record. She wrote about Echo's body never found until Shadow took her to the lake bed. And she wrote about the leash, about how sometimes trauma lived not in words, but in leather straps and silence. When she finished the first draft, the sun had climbed high. Dust motes spun through the air like ash. She saved the document, printed 3 copies, one for herself, one for the journalist in Marlow who never stopped emailing, and one to leave on Devon's grave. But first, there was something else. She opened her closet, pulled out the old canvas satchel. Inside was Shadow's tag, the original brass one from deployment. She'd removed it years ago when the flashbacks began. She clipped it gently back onto his collar. He didn't flinch. He stood taller. The past had teeth. But maybe memory wasn't the enemy. Maybe silence was. She stepped outside with him. Together they walked to the edge of the lot, where the land turned from gravel to dust. A straight line in the earth, barely visible, marked where the town's official property ended. She paused. Shadow did too. "I'm crossing it," she said. He looked up at her, eyes steady. She took a breath and stepped over. A quiet act, but not small. In that moment, Miriam Alvarez, the woman who had once whispered herself invisible, had drawn her line in the sand and chosen not to stay behind it anymore. The cursor blinked like a second heartbeat. Miriam Alvarez sat at the scarred kitchen table of her trailer, desert dusk smoldering outside. Shadow, scarred German Shepherd, once of K-9 Unit 09, dozed by the door, ears attuned to every micro sound. For 2 days, Miriam had sifted evidence. Photos of leaking barrels, toxicology reports, Devon's field notes, a doctor's unsigned warning, satellite images showing Solzhen's decommissioned test field a mile from trailer homes, and the photograph that refused to vanish. Devon laughing, Shadow at his knee, a young Landon Hayes, now mayor, half hidden in shade. Tonight, she would stop surviving and start testifying. "My name is Miriam Alvarez. I worked 5 years inside the Department of Military Contract Oversight. I stayed silent after Solace Springs. 4 children are sick. A 5th may not survive winter. Shadow once saved lives when the system would not. I'm writing because he's still trying, and I'm done pretending obedience is justice." She disclosed how Solzhen tested banned agents near civilians, blamed a training accident for Devon's death and Echo the dogs, then promoted Hayes. She attached every document, marked Devon's final note, "The dirt glows at night, tell Miriam," and Shadow's morning photo, eyes weary, tag glinting Shadow. If systems forget the living, then those who remember must speak louder. She addressed every journalist, watchdog, and lawyer she'd ever met. Subject: Echoes from Solace Springs Statement of Record. One last glance at Shadow. Not winning, just refusing another burial, she thought, and hit send. There was no crash of thunder, only the laptop's soft whoosh. But a line had moved. Night. A dry wind hissed through trailer seams. Miriam, half asleep on the couch, surfaced to Shadow's low warning growl. Click metal on metal. A rusted gate nudged open. Shadow rose. A window cracked wider than the breeze had left it. Another sound. Deliberate boots on porch planks. Glass shattered. A gloved arm plunged through. A flashlight clattered. Shadow launched, jaws snapping shut on air as the arm jerked away. Then the back door lock clicked, opened. A silhouette stepped inside, baton gleaming. Miriam's fingers found the flare gun Devon had insisted she keep. "Back off!" Her voice trembled, but the barrel stayed level. The intruder advanced. Shadow hit him mid-stride. Metal shelves collapsed in an avalanche of cans. The man screamed. Miriam fired the flare, roared red, searing walls, flooding the night sky. The attacker flung Shadow aside and bolted, leaving a smear of blood on the railing and jammed Wi-Fi gear in the yard. Shadow limped back inside, eyes wide, not with pain but shame, as if apologizing for an incomplete kill. Miriam knelt, cupped his muzzle. "You saved me." They spent dawn fortifying windows, jamming chairs against doors. Router dead, phone signal blocked. Whoever came had cut communication first. She packed a go-bag for the first time since Devon's death and left the flare gun loaded. The files were out. Now came the reply in force. Shadow refused to sleep, watching sun bleed across desert flats. Late morning, a convoy of rusted cars arrived, people Miriam had once defended when she still believed the law could be bent toward mercy. Estella drove the first truck, blanket wrapped around her sick grandchildren. Others followed, single mothers, an injured veteran, a scarred waitress. Each carried water, food, solar chargers, plywood, tools, unasked gifts. "You spoke for us," Estella said. "Now we speak with you." A child approached Shadow. He sniffed, then pressed his nose into her small palm. His tail thumped once. Estella wiped tears. He remembers. Neighbors boarded windows, patched the fence, rewired the generator. A man set up a radio scanner. Another installed motion lights. They weren't a militia, just survivors building a shield around one of their own. When Estella clipped a solar charger to the roof, Miriam's phone revived. 37 missed calls, 12 voicemails, and a national outlet's email. "We believe you." Thunder rumbled above dry clouds, noise without rain, but loud enough to prove silence could carry weight. By dusk, the trailer lot hummed with quiet industry. Miriam stood at its edge, Shadow leaning into her thigh. "They're listening now," she told him. Shadow sat. No growl, no bark, only watchfulness. A child handed Miriam a crayon drawing. "Shadow beneath a bright sun. You keep us safe," scrawled below. Miriam pressed it to her chest. Midnight. Headlights swept the highway. 3 unmarked SUVs. Engines cut a mile away. In radio static, Tomas whispered, "Vehicles stopped. Men fanning out. Probably private security." Miriam's defenders took positions. Motion lights ready, radios tuned, mothers sheltering children in Estella's van. Shadow bristled beside the porch, hearing tones humans missed. The first intruder crossed the outer fence. Spotlights snapped on neighbors. Clanged metal, shouted, made numbers seem greater. Shadow charged, teeth glinting. A muffled curse. Retreating boots. A second group tried the south drain pipe. A flare arced across sky Miriam's signal. Shadow lunged again. Intruders fled. No gunfire came. Paid bullies, not assassins. Their intimidation wilted under unexpected resistance. Within minutes, SUVs reversed, gravel spitting. Desert swallowed taillights. A cheer rose, tired, ragged, victorious. Shadow circled the children, tail wagging slow. then stopped at Miriam's side. She stroked his scar. They learned it won't be easy. Dawn's first light revealed dust, but no blood. The community cooked eggs on camp stoves. Someone rigged speakers, played an old protest song. Emails flooded in. Regional papers, state senators. A whistleblower hotline offered legal escort. Estella read aloud testimony requests. Miriam scheduled interviews. An aid convoy from a Phoenix nonprofit arrived with bottled water and portable air scrubbers. Reporters set up across the road. Estella and Tomas acted as spokespeople, shielding Miriam. Shadow posed beside the children. Cameras loved his weathered dignity. Mayor Hayes held a press conference blaming outside agitators. But leaked Solgen documents hit the net that afternoon, Calder's signature on every approval. Under pressure, state police took control of the investigation. That night, a mobile clinic treated the sick kids. Doctors confirmed Solgen toxins in their bloodstreams. The youngest, Anna, hugged Shadow's neck. It doesn't hurt as much when he's here. 2 weeks later, congressional staff visited. Miriam testified under oath. Reyes's files corroborated her story. A bipartisan task force subpoenaed Solgen execs. Mayor Hayes resigned, citing health issues. Devon's name was cleared posthumously. Echo and Shadow were hailed as silent whistleblowers, loyalty turned evidence. A memorial went up at Lake Merrow where Devon died. A bronze shepherd staring into rippling water, plaque reading, "Heroes aren't buried, they're remembered." Miriam returned to the trailer park to find a handy painted sign. "Welcome to Shadow's Line, Papachu 128. The community had claimed the space, barricaded against silence. She knelt beside Shadow, now grayer, ribs showing older wars. "You ready to rest?" she asked. He licked her hand once, but his ears twitched toward distant traffic the world still needed guarding. "Then we keep going," she whispered, and rose with him. Above them, the desert sky burned orange, not with toxins, but with promise. A horizon where watchdogs canine and human kept the line bright enough for anyone willing to see. The community center had never held so many people. Folding chairs scraped across the basketball court. Swamp coolers rattled against furnace-dew hot air. And the town's faded banner, Solace Springs Council. In unity, strength drooped over a makeshift dais. Mayor Landon Hayes sat at its center, jacket crisp, smile polished. 2 jittery council members clutched Miriam Alvarez's evidence packet, like bad tarot cards. The double doors opened. Conversations died. Miriam entered with Shadow, scarred German shepherd, eyes fixed on Hayes's hands. She felt 100 stares. Townsfolk, freelancers, clutching cameras. Estella's quietly determined allies fanned along the back wall. At the microphone, Councilwoman Perez offered 10 minutes. Miriam's voice held. 23 barrels of banned pesticide, DMP-42B, sit in an unsecured warehouse abutting Solgen's old test field. Pediatric illness clusters mapped directly under prevailing winds and groundwater flow. A blown-up map went up. Murmurs rippled. She continued. Mission files placed then NI Overseer Landon Hayes. At that field, the weak 9-second Echo and Shadow were exposed. My partner, Devon Reyes, died from that exposure. Hayes leaned forward, tone syrupy. Miss Alvarez's grief is understandable, but these claims are unverified. Miriam slid Dr. Eli Banner's vanished contamination letter across the dais. Shadow's low growl hummed through the mic stands. Photos of leaking barrels hit the table. Councilman Ruiz demanded answers about emergency funds routed through Hayes's private development. Hayes called them industrial degreasers. Laughter bubbled from the back row. Degreaser doesn't strip paint off 30 feet of concrete, Miriam said. Perez banged the gavel. We'll bring state and federal investigators and freeze discretionary funds under the mayor's office. Applause tentative but real rose. Shadow's posture eased, as though a burden shifted onto broader shoulders. Meeting recessed. Townspeople thanked Miriam. Estella's grandchildren offered Shadow a foil-wrapped cookie. Hayes huddled with his lawyer, veneer fractured but intact. Shadow nudged Miriam toward the exit. Outside, the air finally smelled of imminent rain. Most attendees trickled away, but Estella's 4 sick grandchildren lingered in back. A volunteer medic listened to little Samuel's wheeze. Suddenly, 8-year-old Libby, pale, inhaler clenched, struggled upright and shuffled to the mic. Councilwoman Perez tried to redirect her. Libby shook her head. I have to say something. Across the room, Hayes froze. Libby's voice quavered, but carried. "Mayor Hayes came to our motel. He gave us bottled water, said it would help us get better." She lifted a rash-flecked arm. After that, Maggie's skin burned. Sammy couldn't stop coughing. Hayes stepped forward. "Those bottles were sealed donations." Libby's reply was a clear, lethal whisper. "Mayor Hayes gave us water that made us sick." Silence collapsed onto the room. Miriam raised a photo of identical bottles stacked beside pesticide barrels. Date-stamped the day Hayes routed relief supplies. Questions erupted. A rancher's nephew's nosebleeds. A teacher's seizing students. Perez suspended Hayes' authority over health funds pending investigation. Applause surged. Libby's knees buckled. Shadow braced under her arm until Miriam gathered the child. Cameras captured Hayes staring not at Miriam, but at Shadow, recognizing the threat of a dog that remembers. Gavel down. Hayes slipped through a side exit, heartbeat echoing in trophy-aligned corridors. Shadow followed, silent sentinel. Outside beneath a sodium lamp, Hayes hunched against chain link, skin waxy beneath sweat. Miriam arrived moments later. "Running, Mr. Mayor?" Hayes' polish crumbled. "Devon trusted me." Echo panicked, chemicals choking her. Devon dragged the dog out. They promised it would stay buried. Shadow took one step. Hayes slid down the fence. Sirens topped the block. Deputies detained Hayes as he whispered to the dog, "I'm sorry." Miriam's answer, "You had 25 years." Shadow stepped aside only when cuffs clicked. Perez emerged. State agents at dawn. Miriam felt no triumph, only ground finally solid. Shadow exhaled a shuddering breath. Tremor stilled. News vans bloomed the next morning. State investigators sampled soil. EPA teams pumped groundwater. Hayes' warehouse was sealed in hazard tape. Solgen's executives received subpoenas by lunch. Inside the community center, a medical clinic sprang up. Doctors confirmed Solgen toxins in the children's blood. Libby hugged Shadow's neck. "It hurts less when he's here," she whispered. Miriam's phone pinged. National networks requested interviews. She forwarded everything to the environmental lawyer who'd once said, "Send it straight to me." Meanwhile, Estella's allies erected motion lights, patched fences, fitted a new router. The trailer park became a commune of watchfulness. State troopers transferred Hayes to county jail pending federal charges. In the courthouse lobby, Perez announced that Solace Springs would sue Solgen for environmental damages and wrongful deaths. Weeks later, a bronze shepherd statue, Echo and Shadow intertwined, rose at the lake where Devon died. Plaque: "Heroes aren't buried, they're remembered." Devon's name rested beside Echo's. Shadow attended the ceremony, wearing a new tag etched Unit 09, retired, still serving. Miriam testified in Austin, then D.C., flanked by Shadow and Reyes's father. Congressional staff opened an inquiry into defense contract labs. Solgen's stock cratered. Back home, Estella led weekly water tests. Townspeople planted drought-resistant trees where barrels once leaked. Libby's inhaler rests unused more often now. Samuel's cough wanes. A radio scanner on Miriam's porch reports weather, not warning. One desert evening, Miriam knelt beside Shadow at the freshly painted park sign, "Welcome to Shadow's Line, Pop 128." The dog gazed down Main Street, ears relaxed. "You're ready to rest?" Miriam asked. Shadow licked her palm but pricked an ear toward distant traffic as if saying the world might still need watching. Miriam smiled, rose, and followed the dog into sunset. The road ahead, clear, straight, and honest, beneath a sky at last unpoisoned by secrets. 3 weeks after the hearing, Solace Springs no longer sounded the same. Helicopter rotors thudded overhead at dawn, followed by the metallic grind of drilling rigs and the hiss of negative pressure tents inflating over poisoned soil. The Environmental Protection Agency had arrived with white trucks, hazmat suits, and a resolution signed by a federal judge. Immediate remediation and forensic survey, Solgen sector. Residents watched from porch rails and shop windows as crews bored test cores along the abandoned training field, cataloged each barrel from the warehouse, and erected floodlights that burned through the desert night. Where children once rode bicycles along dusty paths, caution tape now fluttered like broken kite string. The air smelled of bleach, diesel, and something older finally stirred from hiding. Mayor Landon Hayes never returned to his office. A grand jury indictment, mail fraud, reckless endangerment, manslaughter, conspiracy was handed down in Phoenix. When the U.S. Marshals escorted him into a courthouse basement for processing, reporters swore he looked years older, hair disheveled, eyes hollow. A single camera flash caught him whispering a name, Devon, before the elevator doors closed. Solgen corporate headquarters fared little better. Stock halted at open seized internal servers, flashing on the evening news. EPA and DOJ issue cease and desist. By week's end, the board dissolved the company, assets funneled into a federal cleanup fund. For most towns across the county, Solgen was already a relic, but here, in this strip of desert, its ghost had lingered longest. Now even the ghost had nowhere left to hide. Miriam watched all of it from the edge of the action, half participant, half witness. She spent her mornings translating records for the EPA's legal team, her afternoons ferrying Estella's grandchildren to specialist appointments funded by an emergency victims fund. Each night, she returned to a trailer that no longer felt like a bunker, but a home with the windows finally opened. Shadow healed, too. His limp eased under the gentle regimen prescribed by a volunteer vet corps. The tremors came less often, and when they did, he sought Miriam's hand instead of pacing alone. He'd taken to lying on the front step, head high, surveying the bustle of remediation as though counting each truck until the land was safe again. One evening, the town gathered on the old courthouse lawn, now freshly reseeded. The soil cleared of residue. Folding chairs and borrowed church pews faced a simple cedar plinth draped in a navy cloth. At its base sat 4 pairs of tiny boots, placed there by Estella, Sammy's, Maggie's, Jack's, and Libby's. Each pair small, scuffed, evidence of miles walked through sickness toward hope. Behind them stood a larger set, cracked leather combat boots that once belonged to Devon Reyes. Miriam had driven to his sister's house in Bisbee to collect them. She polished them only enough to remove the dust. The rest of the wear remained, a map of where he had gone. Councilwoman Perez stepped to the microphone, her voice carried across dusk. Tonight we remember those who suffered unseen. We pledge that no barrel, no ledger line, no silence will ever bury their names again. She pulled the cloth aside, revealing the memorial. 2 interlocked silhouettes, cut from weathered steel. 1 human, 1 canine, standing shoulder to shoulder, heads tilted toward an unseen horizon. Below, a brass plate read, Devon Rise, Echo Shadow. And all who paid the price of forgetting, murmurs swept over the crowd, soft as prayer. Miriam felt Shadow lean against her leg. His eyes were fixed, not on the statue, but on the boots beneath it. She knelt, tracing the edge of Echo's new nameplate letters, etched deep. No longer a code word, but a promise. At the foot of the steel figures, Libby placed a drawing, a bright sun rising over 2 shepherds, tails intertwined. When it was Miriam's turn to speak, she kept it brief. The desert remembers, she said, voice clear beneath the wide-open sky. It holds everything we try to bury, pain, truth, even hope. Tonight we lay down the weight together. She stepped back, letting the night settle. Coyotes howled beyond the ridge, their calls echoing down dry arroyo walls. Instead of fear, their voices felt like acknowledgement, a wild litany to close a long-held wound. One by one, townspeople approached the monument. A teenager left an inhaler, the same brand that had steadied Libby's lungs. A rancher set a tin cup filled with clear water pulled from a new EPA-certified well. Estella pressed her rosary beads to the brass plaque, lips moving in silent thanks. Shadow trotted forward last, carrying something in his mouth. The crowd fell quiet as he laid a frayed length of canvas at the base of the statue, the final scrap of the leash Miriam once burned. Only the metal clasp remained intact, glinting under string lights. Shadow lowered his head, ears relaxed, tail giving one soft sweep through the grass. Miriam felt tears catch in her throat, but they were not heavy. They were light, like the first cool breeze after a storm. Overhead, floodlights on distant remediation rigs shut down one by one. Stars emerged sharp, bright, unhidden. The hush that followed was not the hush of secrets kept, but the deep, resonant quiet of land beginning to heal. For the first time, the town breathed together, lungs clear, water pure. Ground turned toward new growth, and in that shared breath, scarred dog and scarred people found something that felt irrevocably like home. The hour before sunset painted Solace Springs, the color of quiet forgiveness, lavender sky, peach gold dust rising with every footstep. Miriam sat on the porch rail of her trailer, shoulders relaxed against a post that once bore bullet scars, now sanded smooth. Wood creaked beneath her, but it was a familiar song, home relearned note by note. Shadow lay on the porch plank beside her, body stretched long in the vanishing sun. The big shepherd had thinned this past month. The old shrapnel scar was a pale seam under grizzled fur, ribs moving in slow, steady breaths. His eyes were half closed, but they tracked the shape of every child who darted through the yard. Estella's grandchildren had turned Miriam's dirt patch into an impromptu field of invention, broken hockey sticks for swords, a flattened cardboard box for a pirate ship, 2 overturned buckets marking the foul lines of an imaginary ball game. They moved with that fierce, effortless joy children discover once danger stops breathing down their necks. Little Maggie, her cheeks now full of color the doctors once feared would never return, skipped toward the porch carrying a wildflower. A single desert primrose plucked from the edge of the lot, petals the soft pink of dawn. She climbed the steps carefully, stopping beside Shadow. "He is asleep," she whispered. "Resting," Miriam said. Maggie knelt, placing the primrose beside the shepherd's muzzle. "For you, Captain Shadow." She pronounced captain the way she'd heard grown-ups praise first responders to her, the rank ranked above king. The flower's stem trembled against the wood as a breeze teased past. Shadow didn't lift his head, but one ear twitched. Then, after a long, deliberate pause, his tail gave a single slow sweep across the porch thump before settling again. Maggie beamed, patted his paw with careful fingers, and ran back to join her brothers and sister. Their laughter soared clear, bright, ricocheting against the trailer walls and skipping out over the desert scrub. Miriam exhaled through a smile too big for lingering sadness. She traced 2 knuckles across Shadow's shoulder. "Still on duty, aren't you, partner?" The shepherd's breathing hitched just slightly, then steadied. He shifted his weight, pushing his chin closer to the primrose as though to guard it. Evening light gilded the silver in his coat, turning scars into threads of copper. Across the yard, Estella shuffled from her camper carrying a pitcher of lemonade, pausing every few steps to let her knees adjust. 3 neighbors, Tomas, Councilwoman Perez, and the young teacher who testified, sat on folding chairs, reviewing blueprints for a community garden funded by the settlement money. Wind lifted the papers, and Tomas pinned them with a calloused palm. Life, once hidden beneath layers of fear, bustled now in plain sight. Miriam leaned back, gaze drifting to the perimeter fence. Beyond it lay the remediation site, a field of white tents and drilling rigs made small by distance. Tonight, only a few sentinel lights burned, each encased in a translucent hood to keep from blinding the stars. Work crews would return at dawn, but for now, the land rested quiet hum replaced by cricket song. She looked down at Shadow again. His eyelids fluttered as though dreams brushed the edge of wakefulness. Maybe he was walking the ridge trail with Devon, sun on their backs, Echo loping alongside. Maybe he was hearing the chorus of muffled hearts in the council chamber when a child's voice rose to fill the silence. Or maybe all that mattered now was the weight of a single flower, gifted by a little girl who'd lived to see spring because a tired old dog refused to forget. Miriam's eyes stung. She blinked the dusk into softer focus. The children changed games now, a treasure hunt. Jack called out clues. Sammy toddled after. Libby kept score on a scrap of cardboard folded into a clipboard. Maggie darted across the yard, returned to the porch once more, and tucked a pebble, a good luck stone, next to the primrose. Shadow's tail thumped again. 2 beats, slower than before, but sure. Sunlight slid lower, slipping through fence slats to dapple the floorboards. In that mottled glow, Miriam could almost see currents of time, years distilled into breath, into paw prints fading under nightly winds. She thought of the first day she found shadow ribs showing eyes haunted, the desert rain washing runnels into roadside sand. She thought of every dark night he paced, restless, and every dawn he guarded rattlesnake and flood alike. She thought of the town hall when he planted himself between truth and power and did not move. Now, on this quiet evening, the children's game spilled into laughter so sudden it startled the mourning doves. Shadow's ear flicked toward the sound, ever vigilant, but he made no effort to rise. Instead, he let out a breath that fluttered the primrose petals. as if giving the flower permission to keep watch in his stead. Miriam settled beside him, legs crossed, her hand resting over his heartbeat. "You can sleep," she murmured. "We've got it from here." He didn't close his eyes, not yet. He watched one last loop of the children's chase, Libby tagging Jack, Jack bowing dramatic defeat, Maggie cheering over Sammy's shoulder. The peach light thinned. First stars blinked awake, shy at the horizon. Shadows stretched long as lullabies. Finally, Shadow's gaze drifted to the desert beyond the fence. The wind lifted through the creosote, carrying a scent of distant rain. He exhaled once more, long, steady, content. Then his eyes eased shut, and his chest rose, fell, rose again. The primrose glowed faintly pink against the twilight dark. Miriam stayed very still, counting breaths, feeling each one like a page turned. Somewhere behind her, Estella called the children for lemonade. Feet pounded up the steps, then slowed when they saw Shadow sleeping. Libby whispered, "Let's be quiet. Captain's on watch." And so they tiptoed past, small hands brushing Miriam's shoulder, soft smiles sharing the hush. The porch filled with the scent of lemons and sugar, and in its gentle sweetness Miriam realized duty had become legacy. Guard had become guardian angel. Shadow's tail did not lift again, but it had wagged once. It had said enough. Winter in the Arizona desert feels less like a season and more like mercy-cool mornings that smell of creosote and distant snowmelt, afternoons that wrap sunlight around your shoulders but never scorch. On one such morning, the people of Solace Springs gathered at the crest of the newly restored ridge trail, where the ground once hid barrels and ghosts. Now a broad flagstone plaza overlooks scrub valleys turning green after long overdue rain. A stainless steel pedestal rose from the center of the plaza. Atop it sat a bronze casting of a German shepherd in mid-stride, head lifted, ears forward, tail sweeping the air watchful, determined, eternally moving toward the invisible thing that needed saving. The sculptor had captured tiny asymmetries, the faint dip in one ear, the hush of scar tissue on the flank. Even in metal, the dog seemed alive. Miriam stood behind a portable lectern draped with a navy cloth. Her hair, once kept in a functional bun, now fell in salt and pepper waves to her shoulders. Grief lines had softened. The rawness of summer had tempered into something steadier like the desert after rain, pitted but blooming. Around her, folding chairs filled with townspeople, EPA engineers, state officials, and children with plastic cups of lemonade. At the front sat Estella and her grandchildren. Maggie hugged a stuffed shepherd doll. Libby clutched a small bouquet of primrose long preserved in wax. Miriam took a breath, the microphone crackling softly. "Thank you for coming," she began. Her voice carried across the plaza, unbroken. When this ridge was cordoned off 8 months ago, it was a scar. It held poison, secrets, and the bones of courage we almost forgot. She paused, gaze brushing the distant horizon where remediation rigs had been replaced by saplings staked against the wind. Today, we open it as a promise instead. She turned to the sculpture. A hush fell. Wind tugged at jackets. Someone sniffled, but no one spoke. Miriam lifted a small wooden box from the podium and opened the lid. Inside lay 2 collars, one corroded, the name tag barely legible echo rescued from a lakebed of dust and silence. The other, well-worn leather, brass plate, polished to gleam shadow. Miriam's fingers lingered on the second. The leather was cracked at the bend, where it had once buckled around a thick neck. She set Echo's collar on a velvet pad at the statue's base, then held Shadow's up to the light. "I have been asked to speak about evidence," she said, voice trembling for the first time. "But evidence isn't always numbers or signatures. Sometimes evidence is a bark in the dark, a tail that thumps once to say, 'Believe me.'" Shadow couldn't speak, but he remembered. And because of him, we remembered too. Libby pressed the bouquet of waxed primrose into Maggie's lap so she could clap. Others joined soft at first, rising like wind through cottonwood. Miriam continued. "He warned us about rattlesnakes, about floods, and finally, about the poison we let seep into our children's veins. He taught me and teaches us still that silence never protects the innocent. Only truth does." She knelt, placed Shadow's collar beside Echo's so the nameplates kissed, old metal against older metal. A ray of sun caught the brass and flared bright, as if acknowledging the reunion. Miriam bowed her head. When she rose, Councilwoman Perez stepped forward, holding a plaque. She read aloud. In honor of Shadow K9 Unit, guardian of Solace Springs, whose vigilance saved lives and whose memory reminds us that courage often comes on 4 legs. She fixed the plaque at the statue's base, beside the collars. Applause followed, raucous, whole, the kind of applause that seals a chapter. A reporter asked Miriam if she had final words for the record. Miriam looked out at the crowd. Estella wiping tears. Tomas standing with arms folded like a quiet sentinel. Children chasing one another along paths now deemed safe. The desert wind slid cool across her cheeks. Final words? She shook her head. Number. Just a beginning. The soil's clean, the water's clear, and this town understands the cost of forgetting. That's enough. The ribbon was cut. Children swarmed the walkway, traced fingers along the bronze fur, posed for photos between the collars. Maggie tucked her primrose bouquet behind the plaque. Jack showed a ranger his science fair notebook, explaining how to test pH like Miss Miriam taught. Perez and the state investigator reviewed the last phase-out work orders. Smiling for the first time in weeks, Miriam stepped back, letting the tide of new stories wash past. She found a bench at the plaza's edge and sat, hands resting on her knees. Mind if I join? A deep voice asked. She turned to see Devin's younger brother, Raphael, who had driven from Tucson for the ceremony. He carried the look of a man who had lived too long in another's shadow, yet found light anyway. Please, she said. They sat without speaking, watching sunlit dust swirl at the shepherd statue's paws. Raphael cleared his throat. He would have loved this. I hope so. He nodded toward the collars. You gave Shadow a good ending. Miriam thought of the last wag, a single beat of grace on the porch rail. He gave it to himself, she whispered. They lapsed into comfortable quiet. Below, the children began a game of tag. Their laughter skittered across the plaza, echoing against sandstone and sky. The bronze dog stood eternal watch, 2 collars gleaming beneath, names preserved against weather and memory alike. And for an instant, Miriam swore she heard a bark on the wind, far off, content, running across foothills that would never again be a minefield. She lifted her face to the sun, closed her eyes, and let the warmth settle over her like a benediction. The dog who warned them all had finally lain down his burden. The town he saved would carry it forward, alert, unafraid, remembering. And that, Miriam knew, was the truest tribute of all. When I look back on Shadow's journey, I'm reminded how a dog's heart can steady our own. German shepherds especially carry a loyalty that feels almost human, standing guard through storms, grief, and every sunrise in between. They teach us that courage isn't loud. It's the quiet choice to keep loving, even when life grows heavy. In their steady eyes we find history, forgiveness, and the promise that no one truly walks alone. If you ever feel like deepening that bond with your own 4-legged companion, I recently came across a gentle set of exercises and stories that nurture trust and shared play. It isn't a sales pitch, just something that made me pause, smile, and see my dog with softer eyes. Should you wish, you can look it up at your own pace. Think of it as a neighborly tip rather than a must-do. For now, hug your dog a little longer tonight. Let their heartbeat settle yours. And remember that the love we give them always finds its way back, tail wag included.